wanted to give people a chance to get to know the gods and monsters in a way that wasn't describing them as horrible. So that is in almost all of Lovecraft's and work and subsequent work, like the gods are this malevolent presence often. Even if they don't come across as malevolent, they always perform a malevolent action. I always thought that was really a short shrift for the gods and monsters, because I never found them to be malevolent. If you actually just think about or like look at the work as a whole, like they're not malevolent, they're not benevolent, like they are uncaring and indifferent. And so when I went to add to the Lovecraft world, I wanted to do two things. I wanted to really center on the gods and monsters, often without even humanity being present in the stories. And also I wanted to give people a way into Lovecraft's work that was not such a high barrier to entry. So I love Lovecraft. I know I know I have not. I said some like less than flattering things in the last 5 minutes about him, but like I love Lovecraft's work. I often turn on YouTube and like will listen to one of the audio stories while I work. They're very soothing to me, even if they're dealing with horrific things. But Lovecraft is not the kind of author you can just give a like single story to and expect people to fall in love with his work, because he does things like add a paragraph about some random god that you've never heard of before, and will reference something in a story and another story and do things that you have to sort of dive into a whole collection of Lovecraft's work. And that's very hard for a lot of people to do, especially when they don't know Lovecraft very well. So I wanted to design our book to be something that you could show to kids, you can show to middle schoolers, you could show to teenagers, you could show to adults who didn't know anything about Lovecraft. And at least by the time they finished the book, they would have a better understanding of who the gods were and their relationship to each other. So for instance, so each of our books here, I believe I can do this. Let's see. Okay, so we've done 2 anthologies so far, and this is the, let's see if I can zoom out here. This is the first one. Oh, there we go. So this is the first one. Cthulhu was hard to spell, and it had 30 different stories about monsters. So we did things like we talked about one of the this person chasing after a god to try and find out who she was, finding this god stuck in ice, which is based upon like Lovecraft's gods. One of them, I can't remember the one because there's so many and they're so hard to pronounce. We did things like tell Lovecraft stories, but down to like a middle school level. So they were just very simplified. And then we also did things like, this is the origin story of the universe. So this is the actual origin story as like told by Lovecraft in graphic novel form. So this is how the entire world got. So this is a lot heavier, but again, by reading this book, you're going to learn about the gods and the mythos themselves. And it's hard to blame Lovecraft for this because this is just not something that he concerned himself with during his life. But in the fact that his mythology grew beyond, I think, what he hoped, but never, I don't think realistically believed would ever happen in his life. He didn't sit down and compile all of this stuff. There is no similarian of Lovecraft's work written by Lovecraft. So in order to find a low barrier to entry place to bring people into Lovecraft's work, so hopefully they extend to the different realms of Lovecraft, whether it's the my favorite book, the dream quest of unknown Kadeth and their dreamlands, which or it's in the Mountain of Madness, or any of the other amazing Lovecraft books. Like, it is so much easier to go into that if you understand who the gods are and who the monsters' relationship to each other and to the universe. And so that is that was the plan. We also did things like this is the Cats of Ulthar, which show up a lot of times. Funny stories about the gods, silly stories, sad stories, but each of them tell a piece of the Lovecraft mythos and bring them sort of together. I can't say for the first time, but I can say for I have not found a good reference to the mythos outside of the Call of Cthulhu book. I would love to have like a reference guide to all of these gods, or like, but more importantly, I would want something that tells the stories of these gods in a way that I could give to my nephew who's like 6, or my wife who is in her 30s and doesn't know Lovecraft, or to a friend of mine who is confused after reading one of the stories, reading the Dunwich Horror, and this is sort of the crux of why we made the book, and what I hope to add to the mythos. I think the mythos has the Cthulhu has so many amazing horror authors who have worked in there, and we were trying to add something that could complement it without feeling like it like it was just telling a bunch of other horror stories. That being said, there are a ton of horror stories, just straight horror stories in this book too, because like, let's be fair, that's why you're coming to Lovecraft, right? Like you come for the horror, you stay for the mythos. Before Matej, I thought this was going to be more about like the actual mythos itself. But when I was talking to Camilla before, she was talking about how, she asked me a bunch of questions about comics and like making comics and like making stories. And I'm wondering if maybe if it makes sense to talk a little bit more about that, or a little bit about like actually making the story, or a little bit more pop culture-y part of the conference, like, or just answer questions that people have, because I know you guys have had a long day. I know it's 8 a.m. here, but it's 5 there. So like, I'm sure you guys have talked about like Lovecraft's mythos all day, the last 2 days. And so if you guys want to talk about like making comics or making books or telling stories, like I'm happy to do that. Okay, I'll show it to you again. It's based on the actual. Hang on, because I always forget, and then he wrote it on the thing. I just have to now enhance. Here we go. Enhance. I don't know what book it's from that he found this story, but the story is this is what he wrote at the top: a Lovecraftian creation myth translated from the Vonich manuscript by the mad alchemist and Anthropocene researcher Eric Young, 1889. So, according to my friend, then the creator of this, like this is canonical, the origin story of the Lovecraft universe from Lovecraft's or one of the follow-up creators' stories. But I'm sorry, I can't pull the actual like story. I can get it for you later. I can go and ask him. But I was really excited when he had it, because it's a piece that I didn't even read. Like I haven't even read it. I hadn't even read it until he made it. So well, that's actually so. I write fantasy. That is, I like taking horror elements like Lovecraft's mythos or demons or monsters and telling stories set in and using them to tell a fantasy setting. And so, I'm often called a horror author. Not that I don't love horror, but um, I have very strong feelings about the kind of author that you are, and the kind of and whether a book is horror or fantasy tends to be how you use the key plot elements to turn the story. So for instance, a horror book will use fear and mystique and terror to like make the plot move forward. I think about something like this isn't a Lovecraft thing, but like I Know What You Did Last Summer, right? Like there's a bunch of like murders and like scary things happen, and like all of the plot always turns on those elements. Whereas with fantasy, the plot usually hinges on magic. So it's a much different way to move and make the story turn. And the same thing with mystery. I know Lovecraft is often is called the father of cosmic horror, but he's also the father of supernatural suspense, the entire genre, where a lot of that's basically thrillers with supernatural elements in it. And so I really fell in love with mythology and fairy tales when I was young. I mean, Greek, because like that's the first thing we were exposed to. But like then fairy tales, the cute ones at first, but really like the horrific ones like are the ones that I really like loved as a kid once I got older. And like I went through the phase I think most humans go into at some point where like the nihilist like phase, and then I moved into the absurdist phase of my life, and throughout it all, I really kept coming back to stories. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an actor and then a director and then an editor. And finally, I moved to Los Angeles from DC. So like, I feel very strongly about movies and TV, but the problem with all of those are, A, you can't do exactly what you want because like there's a huge crew around you. And also like it takes a lot of money to do those things. And I found that as a writer, I had control over the story. I was the only human being who could construct something from nothing. And as a fan of mythology and creation myths, like that was very appealing to me. The idea, the ability to create, to create from nothing. All I needed was a piece of paper and a pencil and a blank page. And while that's scary to most people, I found it thrilling. And I do a lot of nonfiction work. Like I've written 2 nonfiction books. I speak all over the world. I have a training academy called The Complete Creative. But like the thing that I keep coming back to is writing stories, specifically fantasy stories with horror elements in them. And that goes not just for the Lovecraft book, but I have a book series called The Godsverse Chronicles, which is sort of my like epic. We're going to release the 11th book on it early next year. And like, it's again about like gods and humans who are most importantly, like humans taking control of their own destiny and fighting against the destinies that the gods have made for them. And I think you either have to love writing in order to be successful at it, or be compulsed to write. And while I do love the idea of finishing a story, I definitely fall into the like compulsed to write part of it. Like I I go into dark places when I'm not writing, and the only thing that pulls me out of it is like the ability to like construct fiction stories. And especially in the last year, when we were dealing with the pandemic and dealing with the, that this whole thing, I found that like at least I could control the story. Like even though the story kind of works itself out outside of me, like, and some elements happen that I don't expect. Like at the end of the day, I have control of that universe, even when I don't have control over my own life, and certainly not the things that are going on around me. Control and just creation. Like I think that we're, there are two aspects to humanity. There's the creation part and the destruction part, and like, I tend to entropy to destruction, and so being able to, and I think the world entropies to destruction, and so being able to like counter that with creating all of these beautiful worlds or horrific worlds or like whatever worlds you're creating sort of allows you to like build the blocks up. Like we spend so much of our lives like tearing the bricks down and like having bricks torn down around you. I feel like for me, writing is all about like building up like new structures around that like are being destroyed all the time. And sort of, I don't know, I was a punk when I was a kid, so like I feel like it's in a world that like is in the 90s, being punk meant like like raging against this system that thought everything was perfect. But now I think it's much more punk rock to like to give a crap about stuff and like put stuff back, because the world has like changed. Like the world has turned from this like everything is rosy 90s like big blockbuster to like everything is doom and gloom and like the world is falling apart. And I think that for me, punkism has always been about like railing against whatever the prevailing narrative of the world is, because like it's like being the thorn in the side of whatever the prominent ethos of the world is, and showing people that like no, it's not all that. And so like I think that spirit of like raging against authority and like has turned for me from like no, the world is not perfect even though you're saying that everything is good, to now saying no, everything is not horrible, like there is still beauty in the world. And it's been a really interesting transition in the past 20 years, and to see some people go the other way, or to see people who I used to look up to, like, falling into the prevailing narrative that they used to rail so hard against.
So I have a pretty much a bit technical question, but when you come up with an idea, you write the script, and do you actually make a storyboard before doing the actual panels, or you just go with the flow, or maybe you just make only the storyboard without the script, which is uncommon, but I've seen some people doing this. So
usually I'm not writing my own. I'm not drawing my own books, but when I do, I just go straight to the script. I don't do any writing beforehand. I just draw, and then, because I'm not a very good artist, and so if I write something that I can't draw, then it's going to bum me out. But if I draw something, like I'll often spend time drawing something, or like saying, oh, I really would love this story to go this way, and then I get there and I'm like, oh, I can't draw that. And then like I'm like, what can I draw? oh, I can draw like a stick figure. Okay, like I could like this new character is going to be a stick now because I can draw that. When I'm just writing, I don't like doing thumbnails, which is the little scripting on the side where you draw each panel out, because I'm usually wrong. So what will normally come back is I'll do a script, and let's say a panel is like something says 5 panels. About half the time it'll come back as 5 panels. About a quarter of the time it'll come back as more than 5 panels, and about a quarter of the time it'll come back as less than 5 panels. And I want the artist to have the flexibility to make those determinations, especially when I've worked with them for a long time. So I will, at the beginning, be very didactic in the script, maybe for the first issue we're working together, maybe the first 10 pages. But once the artist and I sort of have a rhythm, which will happen by the end of the first issue of a book. So if you're doing like the first 20 pages, the first 10 pages are always the worst, because they don't know how to interpret your work. Like, they don't have a good grasp on the character yet. So like you might spend a month, 2 months, 3 months doing that first 10 pages so that they understand your flow and your pacing and what they can do. They're also very tentative because they've never worked with you before. Like, they don't know how hard-handed you're going to be or how free you're going to be. So like their work is always a little bit more stilted in those pages. So it's really about like bringing what you want out of them. But once they get it, once they're in the flow of the art, I like to be as hands off as possible. I come from a directing background. And so as a director, they say, once you've hired the actors, your job is 80% done. So my job is really to hire the artist, give them the script, set the pace, and then let them create inside of it. And if I've done it right, then they will bring back something better than I can ever imagine. If I've hired wrong, like, then I have to eat that or find a way to like make it work. I never know if it's going to work in the first kind of issue, because it's always, I don't want to say we're butting heads. Like, it's not butting heads. It's just trying to learn how to work together with somebody new. Whereas I do a book called Ichabod Jones' Monster Hunter. And like, if you love Lovecraft, it's about a psychopath that escapes a mental asylum and becomes a monster hunter, but doesn't know if he's killing monsters, humans, or it's all in his head the whole time. So it's very much like that mind screw, monster battles, like a deep explorations of like the human psyche. And that book, I've worked with the artist Renzo for 15 issues. We're about to finish the 4th arc, and we're on issue 16 now. And I don't even write more than a few words each panel every time anymore, because like, I just need him to know the setting. And he'll come back and be like, came back one time and was like, "This is stupid." And I was like, it's like, "You're right." Or he's like, "These are too many words for this panel. Like, you were crazy. I can't put this many words in a panel." And I was like, "All right, you're right." And so when you have that, and you know you're both working for the same goal, and that you know you're going to get the same goal, because that's like, I think you always start a project believing you're both on the same track. But it's only once you finish a few pages or get into a rhythm that you really know, okay, like, we're on the same track, and and we're going to deliver the book. Like, the book, like, we both are stewards of the book. Because whether you're editing an anthology or you're creating a comic book, like, you are the steward of the book when you make it. Like you are the keeper of the keys, and you need to protect it with your life. But what your hope is that by the time you're done with the book, the creators will be the other creators will also be as invested and as big stewards of your work as you are, and that love it as much as you, and be as protective of it as you are. And it's a creating a comic, especially, but even a novel with the editor, it's about opening up and letting other people into this world that you have created for yourself, and allowing them to be stewards of it and guide it along and shepherd it, and make a product that you couldn't just make yourself.
Okay, Russell, thank you very much for opening up. Unfortunately, this is fascinating, of course, but we're way over time, and we've used the break time, and the next panel is starting right now. So we really do have to finish.
No problem. Well, thank you for having me.
It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you very much.
If you ever want to visit us again, we would gladly have you, and we could continue this conversation for hours. I have a feeling.
Yeah, it's so interesting that we can talk and talk.
I'd love to. And, if you guys want to find more of my work, I have an app called Wannabe Plus on Android and Apple. You can get a month for free, read all of the stuff that you want from my library. It's $3.99 a month after that, but that first month is free, and you can get like 100 interviews that I've done with other creators, and a whole bunch of courses and other stuff that I've done as well.
Okay, so please send us the link.
We will share it with our viewers, and I'm definitely buying.
Sounds great. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Goodbye. See you soon, we hope.
Okay, Camila, I have a favor to ask you. I have some technical stuff to take care of. Could you stay here for a while? Welcome the guests.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. We'll be back online in a minute.
But will you come back, please?
Yeah, in 5 minutes or so.
Okay.
By the way, were you able to hear me now? I'm asking our viewers because there was a problem before.
Are we streaming right now?
Yeah, we are. But I'm stopping now. Just give me a sec. I'm going to the other room.
Okay, so just maybe I should come back to the main session and.
Tak robię.
Okay.
Co? Nie jestem na wizji. No co?
Bo chodzi o to, że nie przeczytasz, ale...
Finished the previous panel. Oh, Mateusz is with us.
Tak, ja to wiem.
Hello.
Cześć. Idź teraz przygotować z konkursu wszystkie odpowiedzi i zebrać jakieś fajne pytania. No to niech to Natalia zrobi.
You know, boss stuff.
Okay, sorry for that. Welcome everyone. We're going to start in a minute. We can all move to the breakout room. Some of our presentations in this panel have been pre-recorded, so we'll just use the materials. But
Mateusz,
yes?
Pardon. I have sent you a link to Josefa's presentation. It is a movie that is on our Google Drive. It is extended. It has 31 minutes, but she accepted that it would be instead of the discussion time. And we had some problems with Alvaro's presentation in sharing the screen. This problem seems to be solved, but just in case, I also may prepare the link for you if it would be necessary, then you have it at the Discord channel. Okay. Okay, I will check it, but one thing, can you extend the volume of your microphone, since you are the most silent person from the entire stream? Okay. Okay, great. So, Josefa Alvaro, you will be right now. You will have a message inviting you to this breakout room. So just please accept it just after it will be visible to you. Mateusz, can we start? So I'm assigning them. Fingers crossed for you.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hello. Are we live right now? Or still not? We should be. Okay, I check it. Oh yeah, we are. We are. Okay. Mhm.
Hi.
Hi, is it okay? Okay.
I'm sorry, guys. I turned off the mic again. So let's say all the important info again to our viewers. This panel is called the Arkham House. We're going to hear many things about Lovecraft's literary tradition, people that came before him, after him. Our guests that are with us right now are Josefa Percikova of Slovakia and Alvaro Pina Arabal. You're from Brazil, if I remember correctly. Yeah?
Spain, sorry. Spain, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Well, colorful culture, nevertheless. So we'll start with Josefa's pre-recorded video, and then we'll hear from Alvaro. Our other guests should arrive soon. Two other presentations have been pre-recorded, and they're a bit longer than they should be. So this panel is probably going to last a bit longer than we planned. If there are any other audio problems, please let me know. I'm checking the chat, and I'll try to start Josefa's video right now.
Greetings everyone, my name is Josefa Peučíková and I'm a PhD student at the Constantin the Philosopher University in Nitra in Slovakia. And today I would like to talk about the Cthulhu mythos and its position on what can be called the verge of shared universe and fan fiction. This topic came to my mind during my research on fandom activities and H.P. Lovecraft, since I've been reading many fan fiction also connected with Lovecraft's world and visions. And I was thinking and I was asking myself why some of these works are considered fan fiction and the others original printed works. So now I would like to introduce you to results of my research. First of all, the methodology. At the beginning, we have to define the key terms we are going to discuss. These being the shared universe, fan fiction, among others also pastiche, and not to forget Cthulhu mythos. Then we can start asking questions, the key ones being: how was Lovecraft's universe meant to be? What has changed with August Derleth? And how does the fanfiction fit in? Also, I've analyzed several types of sources, beginning with letters from various authors, then continuing with works of H.P. Lovecraft and other Cthulhu Mythos authors, and also fan fictions, and not to forget, of course, scholarly literature on this topic. Then I would like to suggest you some answers, and I hope we will come to a conclusion. So, first of all, the definition. So, when we talk about a shared fictional universe, it can be described as an intertextual register of works that share a common attribute. There are different kinds of attributes that can be shared, but most of the times you would see a fictional universe that has a topological background in common. That means that works of this universe share the same world. Or, second case, it can be about characters which either act in works of different authors, or the characters from different works are aware of each other, aware that they exist in the same universe, or their meeting, for example, can be depicted or described, which means that the works in this shared universe are connected through an interpersonal network. And then there's also the third option, which will be also our case today, which is a shared set of specific plot devices. So, for example, some tropes or some common entities, some names that are used to represent a certain idea or philosophy. What is also important to know, shared fictional universe can be created by one or more authors, and what is interesting, it can also span through one media or medium or several media forms. A good example of a multimedia or transmedial shared universe is, for example, the world of trading card game Magic the Gathering, which includes cards, also comic books, and also novelizations of some stories, which are not adaptations, so they are not the simple meanings which are only transformed from books, for example, to comic books or anything else, but they are extensions of one specific world. So they are connected with each other, and they do not include the same information. They complement each other. They extend this shared world. Another good example is the universe of World of Warcraft, for example, or more actual now Fortnite universe, for example. These are all good examples of shared fictional universes. What is also important is that the status of authors and also the status of their works is equal in these fictional universes, in these shared universes. This means that there is no work or no author that is more important than the other. There is no author or no work that has more truth in it than the other. They share equal status, which also means that they have to be coherent with each other. So they must not be in opposition. They must not be contradictory of each other. Also, often all works of all of these authors, based on their equal status, are considered canon. So they are ultimately true and what is written in there, what is described in them, is considered true in all cases. We could also try to apply Don Markstein's criteria when considering shared fictional universes, but his focus was more on history of comic books, and also his criteria are more tightly connected to comic book universes, as he describes specific conditions under which certain characters can meet, or under which certain characters are considered to be in one shared universe. However, let's move from this quite general term to two specific artistic forms which often are used in connection with shared fictional universe. These two artistic forms, even though they are minor, gain quite much importance in our case. We are going to talk about pastiche and of course in literary form, as we are talking about Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos in its original form, which emerged in 1930s and 1940s, in the first half of the 20th century, more specifically. So, when we talk about pastiche, we could describe it as a literary work that imitates the style and motives of another author, of the original author. It is important to note that pastiche does not mock the original work. It can be humorous, it can contain puns, for example, and jokes, but it does not mock, it does not make fun of the original work in the way that a parody or satire would do. Also, what is important, pastiche celebrates the original work. It's a celebration of its effect it has on its recipients. It pays tribute to the source work or the author by using specific methods of creation, some plot devices, some tropes. Also, pastiche acknowledges the author, his style, and it is aware of the original work as such and of the meanings it carries. This means that author of pastiche holds some approaches the original work from a distance. They know that it's artistic work they are paying tribute to, but they also know that it's something different from the pastiche itself. This is important mainly when we take a look on fan fiction and when we compare these two artistic forms. Fan fiction can be described differently. It's a literary work, again, but it's a literary work that is written by fans of existing work of popular fiction. For example, written by fans of Harry Potter or by fans of Lord of the Rings, for example, and so on. It also may acknowledge the style of the original author. However, its focus lies on the fictional world inside the original work. It focuses on characters of this work. It focuses on narrative itself. And also the approach of fan fiction towards the author of the original work is absolutely different from pastiche, since in fan fiction the death of the author is implied, which means that fans, as creators of fan fiction, do not take into consideration any meanings of author. The meanings the authors put into his work may be ignored, may be transformed by fans, may be even opposed by them when writing fan fiction.
So
And
we'll be back. Oh, hello. What's it with the stream?
Participative and very active approach of fans towards the original work. It is kind of a subversive approach in terms of changing the original meanings to meanings that fulfill desires of fans. And as you will see, this will be quite important also when we will talk about the Cthulhu mythos. So now let's move to it. Cthulhu mythos nowadays is considered a collection of works which include many works, honestly. However, it's important to make a distinction and to mention at least two of the most important members or two most important figures connected with Cthulhu mythos. The first of them being, of course, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, but the second one being August Derleth. I will also make certain distinction between the way Lovecraft and Derleth had approached Lovecraft's work and his vision of world that he described. However, even though there's a difference, it's exactly the difference, the empty space between them, or that I will focus on, because as one of my colleagues says, the most interesting things happen in between, on the verge. So that is the spot that is maybe a blind spot I will take a focus on. So when talking about the Cthulhu mythos, I will divide this body of works into two groups. The first will be what we can call the Lovecraft mythos. The Lovecraft mythos includes works that were created during Lovecraft's lives, and these are works not only of Lovecraft himself, but also of his fellow friends, writers such as Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Edwin Howard, Donald Van Drey, or even August Derleth himself, and also includes works of other members of the Lovecraft circle. What is interesting is that, and what is typical for the Lovecraft mythos, is that works that are included in this group share some characteristics. These being, for example, fictional books like Necronomicon, Book of Abon, and so on. Fictional entities, just as the probably most popular Cthulhu, or even fictional towns such as Dunwich or Arkham. Also, what connects these works is the shared idea of a cosmic layer of reality that is just beyond our perception, that is hidden behind our notion of a reality we live in, and which, when it is displayed and unveiled, can cause serious trouble to our understanding of our own importance. Also, works of Lovecraft mythos are characterized by carrying meanings of the philosophy of cosmicism, which is a philosophy created by Lovecraft himself that describes the cosmos that surrounds us as a very indifferent space filled with entities that are also very indifferent towards humankind. This means that they don't care about our intentions. They don't care about how we perceive them, how we see them. And they don't care if we survive in the cosmos or if we perish. And this moment of realization that us, the humankind, is not the center of the universe, that is actually the source of horror in Lovecraft's fiction. The indescribable feeling that our anthropocentric way we see each other is completely just unusable anymore. Lovecraft created, as I mentioned, several entities that inhabit this vast cosmos around us. However, what is specific for this group of works, for Lovecraft mythos, is that these entities are lacking any system. They are hardly hierarchized in the way that any human mythology would try to systematize them. As you can see here on the picture, this is the only hierarchy of his beings that Lovecraft has ever created, and even this reflects his approach and expresses his vision of uselessness of such a system, because as you can see, he included some jokes into it. For example, here you can see stated that one of descendants of Yog-Sothoth and Shub-Niggurath is his friend Clark Ashton Smith. Also, here you can see that Lovecraft included even himself in this hierarchy. He also one time, the only time actually, he gave a name to his system of these entities is when he called it Cthulhuism and the Yog-Sothoth, which is actually not described any further, and also includes this mocking tone, which expresses Lovecraft's cosmicist philosophy. Schultz even called this an anti-mythology when he implied that Lovecraft's entities simply cannot be put into categories as we understand them, because despite the classical mythology tries to describe the relationship between God and humans, and that tries to explain intentions of God towards humans, Lovecraft's creatures, entities, they don't do such things. They don't have any relationship towards humanity. They don't have any plans with humanity. They may be aware of our existence, but they don't care. They are indifferent. And as such, Schultz describes Lovecraft's entities as an anti-mythology. On the other hand, when we take a look on what I called Derleth mythos, several significant differences can be seen here. First of them, the Derleth mythos was created after Lovecraft's death. It was created by Derleth, that's the first point, and Derleth, who gave himself the objective of publishing Lovecraft's work, had published several anthologies. However, he didn't include only Lovecraft's works in it. He also added his own into it, as well as some works he has created which were based or inspired by Lovecraft's notes. And then later he also added all works that include even the smallest hint of original Lovecraft's mythos. What is important, however, is that Derleth misunderstood the original vision of H.P. Lovecraft. The Cthulhu mythos, as he called this body of works, he put it into a system, he categorized it, he created a hierarchized system of it, and moreover he added a specific moral background to it, which actually directly opposes the vision of Lovecraft, the vision of indifference, of vastness, of a denial of anthropocentrism. Joshi had basically described three essential misconceptions that Derleth did and that he further promoted. First of them was that Lovecraft's gods were elementals, meaning that they were connected with specific elements of water, air, earth, and fire. Derleth even pointed out that Lovecraft failed in creating these elementals because there was no mention of a fire elemental in his mythology. So Derleth had to create one, which is, as you can see here, Cthugha. The second misconception was the moral background that Derleth added to the original vision of Lovecraft. He divided Lovecraft's entities into two groups that are fighting against each other, with elder gods that represent the forces of good and old ones that represent evil. Here you can also see a further division or further systemization of Derleth's mythos, to be said, where you can see different layers, different ranks of these deities, to be said, which are divided based on their might or based on their ancestry line, based on the elements that Derleth described. Well, and then the third misconception Joshua had pointed out was that Derleth, practicing Christian, made the original mythos philosophically akin to Christianity, and he often hinted that the forces of good and evil also reflect the fight between God and Satan, which was completely wrong, as Lovecraft was a known atheist and did not really include any notion of human religion in his work. However, the last but not least, and certainly very important point that makes Derleth's mythos different from Lovecraft's is that when Derleth learned that his conception is wrong, he didn't correct himself, but intentionally continued to spread his version of the mythos, his theoretical background, including the moral battle and also the religious background. So he had altered the original meanings in these terms. So now, when we have this theoretical background and the information about the differences between two groups of Cthulhu mythos perceptions, let's put it together. So when we take a look on the Cthulhu mythos as a whole again, yet it has to be kept in two groups, because these two groups, the Lovecraft mythos and the Derleth mythos, include very different characteristics, and this way they also have to be considered different types of body of works. Lovecraft mythos, for example, as the first group, can be easily considered a shared fictional universe, as we have described it at the beginning, because the authors and their works in the Lovecraft mythos share the same equal status. So again, there is no better or more truer or more important work among them. Also, they share the same world. It may not be as visible as in other fictional shared universes. However, the main link that connects worlds of Lovecraftian authors in Lovecraft mythos is the layer of cosmic reality. It's the body of plot devices, such as fictional entities and books and topological names, as I have mentioned. And also the works of Lovecraft mythos only show a small tendency of being written in style of pastiche. This can be contributed to the equal status of authors and also to their efforts to write in their own individual styles and in their intentions to create their own pseudo-mythologies, which may have, of course, some common attributes, as I've mentioned, but still remain original on their own. However, on the other hand, when we take a look on the Derleth mythos, things are different again. First of all, there were some intentions to write pastiche. There were many intentions, and very visible, to follow the conceptions of another author. By another author, I mean Lovecraft, because the Cthulhu mythos was already established by Derleth himself. So the other authors had only contributed to this concept. They had expanded it, however, but they all did this according to Derleth's vision, according to changed vision, because there was an original change or shift in reception, a shift of meanings, which means that Derleth's mythos, as such, which followed the altered version of the mythos, can be now considered a fan-fictional literary work, since it subverts, in a way, the original work of H.P. Lovecraft. So now, the conclusion. Oh, well, here you can see one very important quote made by H.P. Lovecraft in a letter to August Derleth, where he describes this, that he would always support the sharing of his figures, of his plot devices, and he would encourage other authors to use it, and that he would also use them from others. So this intentional sharing of these aspects also hints to the nature of a shared fictional universe. On the other hand, then, there's also this quote, which was originally originally it was thought that Lovecraft had said this, and this quote was the main argument, the main weapon, so to say, of August Derleth when he defended and described his version of the Cthulhu mythos. According to this quote, Lovecraft was supposed to understand his universe exactly in Derleth's terms. So with a moral background, with the hint of Christianity and so on. However, later it was uncovered that this quote was false, that it wasn't even a quote, since Mr. Farnese had only described what he thought he remembered Lovecraft saying, and it was simply not truth. However, this statement was something that Derleth used then for a long time, and this was also the key element of Derleth's stance, his position. Anyways, to the conclusion now. So for sure we can say that Lovecraft, the Cthulhu mythos requires detailed view, since it also has to be divided at least into these two groups, as stated as Lovecraft mythos and Derleth mythos, because these two groups of works differ in their nature. Lovecraft mythos can be seen as a shared universe, just as the original author had intended it to be. And then the Derleth mythos, which is based on a misconception and his wrong approach, can be seen as fan fiction, because despite Derleth knowing that he was wrong, he stuck to his version, and he promoted this different meaning, so creating a different narrative from Lovecraft's. Also, then the last question to be asked is, how does it affect the contemporary popular culture? And this is the question I would like to leave open for now, as it requires further research, and I'm hoping that we will look into it further in following years and months. So now, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to feedback from you.
Okay, so that was Józefa's pre-recorded presentation. Thank you for preparing that. A lot of topics were covered. I think it was very interesting. And we'll have some questions about it later, I'm sure. And now we'll proceed to hear what Alvaro has to say about Junji Ito and his manga and their connections to Lovecraft. Are you ready to start?
Sure. I'm sharing right now. Just let me know if something goes wrong. I hope you can see that. Hi everyone, guys. In the first place, I'd like to express my gratitude to the organizing committee for counting on me, for sharing about this topic that I so deeply love, the influence of Lovecraft in horror manga, the work of Junji Ito. Actually, yesterday, St. Yoshi was asked about some of this stuff, and I feel like I can very modestly contribute to that somehow. In the first place, just about how Lovecraft's literature was introduced in Japan. It was actually introduced by a very famous, well-known writer in Japan, Edogawa Rampo, which is a synonym. His actual name was Taro Hirai. I'm listening myself. Can you just turn off the micro, please? Okay, thanks. His real name was Taro Hirai. Edogawa Rampo was a synonym that stands for Edgar Allan Poe. It's the Japanese phonetics pronunciation of Edgar Allan Poe. And this writer, Rampo, was in charge of a journal titled Jules, and in the number of 1948 specifically, he included a number subtitled The Reader's Guide to Horror Stories, the one you can see there on the right, which encompassed different stories both by Lovecraft and by previous writers by whom actually Lovecraft was also influenced, such as Arthur Macken's Algernon Blackus, and those stories were first translated into Japanese in that number. More recently, in 2002, a series of 4 books actually titled Layers of the Hidden Gods were published, which is about these books include new authors, that is Japanese authors, which who have actually been influenced by Lovecraft's works, and also some studies on the work of Lovecraft in the Japanese context are included here. Now, more specifically, was the particular influence of Lovecraft in horror manga. In the first case, the first statement, a big idea I like to state here is the one I put above there in the presentation, that Lovecraftian features are occasional in horror manga and hardly found in actually many of the masters. Jiro Tsunoda, Kazuo Uematsu, Maruo Kago, Hideshi Ino, these are all great masters of horror manga, but what they propose is slightly different. I don't really perceive Lovecraftian characteristics there, For example, Tsunoda and Uematsu are more rooted in a sort of cultural tradition of horror. Maruo and Kago, these are obviously generalizations, but are somehow valid to state this, belong to the Eroguro, which is a combination of erotism and gore. Hideshi Ino, even, who is similar to Junji Ito in the sense that Junji Ito is the one we'll talk a bit more about in depth later. is similar to him in the sense that he proposes an universe of his own. It's very difficult to categorize what he does, what Eno does. I've actually conceived that as idiosyncratic grotesque creatures as a whole. Huh? Even in Katsuhiro Otomo's Domu, A Child's Dream, which is this is a horror work he created before Akira. You know, Otomo is the author of Akira, the well-known Akira. But before that, he created this manga, which again is about horror, but psychic powers, not really Lovecraftian features, but merely psychic powers. Huh? And in the more recent Kengo Hanazawa's I Am a Hero, again, we find Western traits, Western characteristics, but not in the Lovecraftian sense. It's about zombies. As the story unfolds, okay, we can find some apocalypse, some ideas of the unknown, but it's not truly Lovecraftian either. And now there are, however, 5 authors which are who I've compiled here somehow, who I do believe that are influenced by Lovecraft in different ways, but they are certainly influenced by his writing. The first one is Shigeru Mizuki, who took Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror as a point of departure to create sort of a parody. It's quite faithful to the original, but at the same time is creating a parody out of that. Huh? The title is Footsteps from the Depths of the Earth. That was published in 1962. There you can see some pictures. The 2 of them belong to this manga. For instance, the story is set in a Japanese village, not in Dunwich anymore. There was a man wearing a kimono, you know, these usual Japanese clothes just to hide his deformity and grotesque traits. Even, this is perhaps the most remarkable fact, Jigsaw Thoth is parodically named yogurt. Huh? You know, that's hilarious somehow. In the second place, we have Shinichi Koga, who created this manga series between 1975 and 1979, Eko Eko Asarak. And as you can gather, as I guess you can infer from the image I've shared that there with you, it's about cults, witchcraft, summoning other worldly creatures and demons. And that's largely connected to the Elder Gods, definitely. I think he did read Lovecraft's work by that time. Huh? In the third case, we have the Jiro Morohoshi, who again takes some of the features found in Lovecraft's work, such as the fact that the character is a researcher, you know, an antiquarian, a librarian. This varies slightly, but this is the idea. He also takes the Cyclopean cities, the idea of the cults, and adapts that to the Japanese folklore. He uses in Yokai Hunter. This is his work, which is still open somehow. So what he does is adapting, encoding that in the Japanese atmosphere and the Japanese context and folklore. Huh? And I say it's still open because I think in 2012 or something like that, even though he started the series Yokai Hunter very much earlier, he has still continued with that very sporadically, very occasionally. In the fourth case, and this is perhaps one of the most well-known Japanese names when speaking about Lovecraft, is Go Tanabe. Go Tanabe is mainly an adaptator. That is, he has mainly devoted himself to adapt Lovecraft's work. The ones you can see there at the Mountains of Madness, Haunter of the Dark, The Color Out of Space, the ones I shared that with you. And I actually state that what he does is somehow improving the quality of Lovecraft's original stories. Huh? These are great stories of great quality indeed. The details, his detailed style of drawing with so much lines and the contrast between the obscurity and light, white, dark. That's very properly conveyed by this author Go Tanabe. And now we come to the one I wanted to share with you in more depth, a bit more deeply, who is Junji Ito, perhaps the he's perhaps, and I actually think he is the master of horror, Japanese horror manga nowadays. Huh? He was born in 1963. He's devoting himself to manga since he won the Kazuo Mesu Award in 1987, even though he was a former dental prosthetist. Huh? And actually, he balanced both works when he was starting, and finally, eventually, he managed to devote himself only to literature. He's an avid reader of literature, specifically of science fiction. Some of Lovecraft's works actually belong to the science fiction genre, such as At the Mountains of Madness. This. And not in vain, not for nothing, has Junji Ito, adapted some works such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Osamu Dazai, No Longer Human, into manga. These are two adaptations Junji Ito made out of those two literary works. Huh? He has an interest in ars poetica. That is, by ars poetica, I mean his creative style, his creative mind, which is something I've translated from Spanish, because this was in turn translated from Japanese into Spanish as the oblique gaze. By this, Junji Ito means that he observes the daily reality, everyday reality, and he notices there the macabre, the grotesque. He perceives horror there. He's somehow watchful for detecting, for spotting horror in daily reality. Huh? He's been influenced by some of the great mangakas, you may assume, such as Kazuo Mesu, Hideshino, and Lovecraft in the case of literature. And actually here we have the very thing that we have that we must have in order to know when an author is influenced by someone else. That is, the author's own words. Here we have Junji Ito's own words, admitting, recognizing how he was influenced by H.P. Lovecraft. Just let me quickly read this, though I'm... now. He's asked, is there anywhere you would like to adapt into manga in future? And his answer is the following. I wanted to adapt something by Lovecraft. I had thought that I would like to draw the atmosphere of his works with dark touches, but I read Go Tanabe's work, the one we saw before, based on one of Lovecraft's original works, and it is so marvelous that I thought it was no longer necessary to do it. Anyway, I still think that I would like to draw an original manga with the atmosphere of Lovecraft's works. All the same, since the time I started publishing, I have received his influence, so I believe my style would not change too much. So he has not directly adapted Lovecraft, but he has indeed been largely influenced by him. Here, how have I exactly ascertained the influence of the Providence author in the work of Junji Ito? Well, by establishing 4 categories, or rather I say motifs, intertwined motifs, actually, the ones you see here, the cosmic and the apocalyptic motifs, the oniric motif, the monstrous and sectarian motifs, and the musical and sound-related motifs. These, I insist, are intertwined, interchangeable. They collapse with each other at some point. They are, can coexist within the same work. Huh? There on the right, you can see an actual drawing made by Junji Ito of Lovecraft. That is Junji Ito drawing Lovecraft, a drawing included in a recent art book. And more or less quickly, because I don't want this to take too much time, we could be here speaking for hours and hours, but I will just share some of the main references in Junji Ito's oeuvre concerning the influence Lovecraft had on him. In the first case, the cosmic and the apocalyptic, we have these 3 major works, mainly Uzumaki and Hellstar Remina. Uzumaki is very well known. It's about spirals that appear on the earth and that somehow cause obsession in people perceiving those spirals, either in when having a shower with water, even in fingerprints, they become obsessed with that. And towards the end of the story, as the story unfolds, we are presented that sense, that purely Lovecraftian sense of the unknown, of something going beyond human understanding. This ruin, which is also purely Lovecraftian. In Hellstar Remina, we have a planet, an unknown planet just recently discovered, which people call Remina, coming into the earth. Notice its monstrous appearance. It's a living entity, let's say, but at the same time, it's a planet. The planet is a living entity devouring everything as he approaches the earth quickly and relentlessly, actually. And in the third case, we have Junji Ito's most recent work, which is Censor. It's a bit failed. It's not his best work, not at all. But in it, we do perceive, again, and this image is self-explanatory, I guess, this idea of the cult in order to summon a creature from beyond, from the other world. In the case of the oniric, which is, again, largely significantly Lovecraftian, this concept of the onironaut, people going into sleep just in order to explore the dream reality, the dreamlike realities. We have two I've selected two Junji Ito's work. The first one is Den of the Sleep Demon, in which a man is possessed by a demon. There you can see the moment in which it appears. But it only appears, it only comes into view when this character is sleeping, under sleep. And that's, again, clearly connected to that. And in the second case, we have one of Junji Ito's favorite works, which is Long Dream. This is about a man that spends so much time dreaming that in his mind, not operatorily, not in reality, of course, but in his mind, he's living 10, 20, 30 years. In reality, it only passes about 8 hours or 10 hours, but in his dreams it's much longer than that. And here we can see that how the man becomes old, gets much, much older, up to the point, as in Lovecraft's Hypnos, of getting dissolved as a statue of marble. Maybe you remember that story by Lovecraft, Hypnos, and he eventually just vanishes, because his body is experiencing what he actually experiences in the dream. It's a confusion. It's an intertwined, reality and dream are intertwined here. In the first case, just quickly, the monstrous and sectarian. On the left, we can see Ito's Blood Sickness of the White Sand Village. As in many of Lovecraft's works, here we see a specific village, the White Sand Village, which is cursed. We see a curse. In this case, there are veins in which the blood of the inhabitants flow underneath, and that blood is connected with the actual inhabitants' blood. Here we can remind Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space and this kind of village-based story. And also Geo, the one in the middle, is connected with this, because Geo is set in Okinawa, an actual Japanese village, into which all of a sudden fish-like creatures, these fish-like unknown creatures, come as a legion, massively coming into the place, into Okinawa. At the end, we discover that it's a scientific invention causing that, which causes that. But again, this idea of the village, and notice how the connection with the shadow over Innsmouth, because of the fish and the old ones, is clearly there. Bear in mind that it's an influence, not an adaptation. And in the third case, on the right, we see Ito's, again, dissolving classroom, which is about cults, the sectarian and the idea of cult. Here we have the protagonist, this guy you can see there in the picture, who every time he apologizes summons a kind of Lucifer of demon or the worldly entity, is not specified, if I remember well, but specifically what he does is dissolving people's bodies. At every time he summons that by apologizing, it's through apologizing that he does so. He summons this otherworldly demon or Lucifer. And in the last case, we have the musical and sound related motifs, which are largely related to Lovecraft's tale, The Music of Eric Sam. I'm sure you remember that one, which is set in the Rue de Ossel, in a French street, which is never specified, and which doesn't appear in the maps. And this is of paramount importance for Junji Ito's Maptown. The fact of a street, of a place that doesn't appear in the map, I think it inspired Junji Ito's Maptown in this case. Below, you can see the window next door. If you remember in Lovecraft's The Music of Eric Sam, there's a window in this first story, which is somehow connected with the cosmos. It's sort of a chaotic abyss. And in this case, we have this in Junji Ito's. This is a version from the anime, because there's an anime based on this story. I've taken the picture from the anime, but anyway, the manga, the anime, and in this case, we see the theatrological window, this grotesque window connected again with Lovecraft's story. And just to finish these two others, there are many more. I insist there are more than the ones I'm showing here, but The Devil's Logic and The Village of Sirens are both connected with the sound-related events. That is, characters hear a noise, a specific noise, and that noise is somehow either provoking, causing their suicides, as you can see in The Devil's Logic, or simply making people become mad, as in The Village of Sirens. And actually there we eventually find that the village is governed by the devils themselves due to noise. That begins with the sirens, and eventually they govern the place. And very quickly, just the three conclusions. The first one is that, some Japanese horror manga artists have certainly received the influence of Lovecraft's works, whereas others have found their own styles in the genre. I think there are more writers, more mangakas, non-influenced by Lovecraft than those who have been indeed influenced, but those who have are very, very, very significant, very powerful creators. And this may be controversial in the second place, but I do believe this is the fact that Junji Ito not simply adapts nor imitates, but actually emulates. That is, he improves Lovecraft in a different semiotic medium, manga, because we have to bear in mind at all moment that the semiotic, the formal features are different. Manga is mainly is a visual and partially verbal format, where literature is entirely verbal. But I think he does emulate Lovecraft. And in the said case, we can conclude by I will affirm, that Lovecraft did not really invent cosmic horror. And I actually think the next speaker will tell us much more about this, but he did consistently write works based on this motif, as probably no one else did. And that is most likely the reason why he has influenced so many authors, not only in literature, but also, in this case, in mangas, in comics, in filmmakers, and even in video games, more recently with the case of Bloodborne and many others. Those are some short, quick bibliographical references. That's so. Thank you all guys for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Alvaro. Those are guests from the University of Jaén, Spain. Thank you one again. Very interesting presentation. One can tell you're passionate about this, so it was nice to hear. Okay, and now to our next guest, Sean Moreland. Sean is going to tell us about I'm not sure if I have the right abstract. Gould Hunted Woodlands of Weird, George M. Gould and Cosmic Horror Before Lovecraft. That's it, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Sean is from Canada. He's representing the University of Ottawa. And this is a pre-recorded presentation, a bit longer than usual, but you most probably enjoy yourselves anyway. So without further ado, let's hit the road.
Hello, my name is Sean Moreland, and this is a conference presentation that I am recording for PhilosophyCon in May of 2021 on the topic of metaphysical horror. My presentation today is titled The Gould Haunted Woodlands of Weird, George M. Gould and Cosmic Horror Before Lovecraft. I am a long-term appointment adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, and my research interests include weird fiction, horror, and the Gothic in a wide variety of transmedial guises and forms. A little bit of context about the paper that I'm giving today and the research that it comes from. A number of my publications have focused on Lovecraft's writing or Lovecraft's influence and legacy in modern and contemporary weird fiction, horror, and the Gothic. And this presentation in particular is drawing on my chapter in the edited volume New Directions in Supernatural Horror Literature, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2018. My much longer chapter in that volume looks at Lovecraft's cosmic horror in terms of the discourse on the sublime, exploring connections between Lovecraft and 17th through 19th century thinkers of the sublime, as well as Lovecraft's cosmic horror in the broader context of literary modernism. And it portrays cosmic horror as a kind of post First World War mutation of sublimity. So what I'm going to focus on today, though, is just a very small aspect of that broader chapter, which ties into a work in progress that I've been working on for a few years, tentatively titled Repulsive Influences. Repulsive Influences looks at the coextensive history of the reception of Epicurean materialism via Lucretius's poem De Rerum Natura and the emergence of Gothic horror and weird fiction, beginning in the early modern period through to the end of the 20th century. But what I'm going to focus on today is just one particular influence on one particular often overlooked contextual figure who was part of the intellectual and cultural milieu in which Lovecraft developed this conception of cosmic horror. I first came across George Milbury Gould's name in connection to H.P. Lovecraft in a short 2015 editorial by Paul DiFilippo. DiFilippo writes, "Cosmic horror, sometimes dubbed Lovecraftian horror in honor of its most famous exponent, the man whose work helped to crystallize and codify the subgenre. The phrase itself predates Lovecraft, found in such anomalous sources as George Milbury Gould's The Meaning and the Method of Life, a Search for Religion in Biology, published in 1893. DiFilippo's characterization of the American lexicographer, physician, ophthalmologist, and natural theologian George M. Gould's work as anomalous is wonderfully ironic, since Gould remains most famous for his 1896 compendium of anatomical and psychological oddities, anomalies, and curiosities of medicine. But DiFilippo's quip obscures the fact that Gould's conception of cosmic horror, while it has been entirely eclipsed by Lovecraft's since the mid-20th century, was widely influential during the first half of that century and forms part of the historical and intellectual context to which Lovecraft's idea of cosmic horror responds. So what I'm going to do in this brief talk is examine Gould's earlier conception of cosmic horror in the context of his broader career and writings, while arguing that Gould's cosmic horror is a crucial and previously overlooked, for the most part, aspect of the context for Lovecraft's redefinition and popularization of the term. As DiFilippo notes, the notion of cosmic horror has been closely associated with H.P. Lovecraft since the middle of the 20th century. Lovecraft's fictional and critical writings, his essay Supernatural Horror in Literature in particular, helped to redefine and to popularize the term, which would become almost exclusively associated with him by the late 20th century. But Lovecraft was hardly the first to conceive of the affective concept that it describes, one which dates back at least to the early modern period and to the 17th century. The contemporary American horror writer Thomas Ligotti looks back to the writings of French scientist and Christian philosopher Blaise Pascal for an early modern and contrapuntal conception. According to Ligotti, Pascal wrote of his sense of being engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces whereof I know nothing and which know nothing of me. I am terrified. The eternal silence of these infinite spaces fills me with dread. Pascal's, Ligotti notes, is not an unnatural reaction for those phobic to infinite spaces that know nothing of them. Nor, it's worth pointing out, did Lovecraft coin the phrase cosmic horror itself. It was already in circulation before Lovecraft's birth. The earliest example I've been able to find of the phrase, using Google Ngram to search the textual corpus available through the Internet Archive and through Google Books, and you can see that on this slide, occurs as part of a journalistic description of the period leading up to the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. Quote, "We could feel that some cosmic horror was impending long before the catastrophe took place, and I fancy that other sensations of a like nature are in store. We hear from one part of Asia of atmospheric phenomena which disturb numerous and delicate people." From this apparently first appearance, nearly a half century before Lovecraft began to use the term cosmic horror, the term was associated with an atmosphere in the most literal sense, one that delicate people were especially responsive to, and one involving a disturbing intimation of threatening immensity. This usage derives from the idea of cosmic emotion, which was developed by the English mathematician and philosopher William Kingdon Clifford, who in turn derived it from the English utilitarian philosopher Henry Sedgwick. Clifford defines what he means by the term cosmic emotion in his 1877 essay titled The Cosmic Emotion. By a cosmic emotion, the phrase is Mr. Sidgwick's, I mean an emotion which is felt in regard to the universe or sum of things viewed as a cosmos or order. There are two kinds of cosmic emotion, one having reference to the macrocosm or universe surrounding and containing us, the other relating to the microcosm or universe of our souls. When we try to put together the most general conceptions that we can form about the great aggregate of events that are always going on to strike a sort of balance among the feelings which these events produce in us, and to add to these the feeling of vastness associated with an attempt to represent the whole of existence, then we experience a cosmic emotion of the first kind. It may have the character of awe, veneration, resignation, submission, or it may be an overpowering stimulus to action. Clifford points to an admirable synthesis of these two forms in a sentence by Immanuel Kant, which has been, in his words, perfectly translated by Lord Houghton. The two things I contemplate with ceaseless awe, the stars of heaven and man's sense of law. Clifford's cosmic emotion is a version of the Kantian sublime, influenced by Herbert Spencer's progressivist evolutionary views. Clifford calls it the cosmic emotion rather than specifying what emotion it is, because, quote, the character of the emotion with which men contemplate the world, the temper in which they stand in the presence of the immensities and the eternities, must depend, first of all, on what they think the world is. In other words, whether the cosmic emotion is awe, terror, or horror depends on how the world, reality, is understood, an understanding that changes drastically with historical and cultural context and with the development of scientific knowledge. In Clifford's words, whatever conception then we can form of the external cosmos must be regarded as only provisional and not final, as waiting revision when we shall have pushed the bounds of our knowledge further away in space and time. Clifford's cosmic emotion influenced William James, whose The Varieties of Religious Experience in 1902 presents it as a natural legitimation of religious belief. Ligotti notes the contrast between James and Lovecraft in this regard. Quote, in both his creative writings and letters, Lovecraft's expression of the feelings James describes form an exception to the philosopher-psychologist's argument, since Lovecraft experienced such cosmic wonder in the absence of religious belief. This slide contains a search, the results of a search using Google Ngram, using cosmic horror, cosmic terror, and cosmic emotion as the Ngram search terms. And it visualizes the transition in frequency of usage between Clifford's term cosmic emotion, the blue line, which as of the 1870s is by far the most widely occurring of these phrases in the corpus accessible via the Internet Archives. The transition to Gould's cosmic horror, which is visualized in the red line there, is made visible here. And if you look in context at the usages of the phrase cosmic horror between, say, 1890 and roughly the 1920s, you'll find that virtually every use of that phrase directs back to Gould's use of the term and is linked to Gould's conception of cosmic horror. If you look at the instances and the examples, particularly after the late 1940s, after Arkham House has been created, Lovecraft's works are beginning to circulate more widely. More people are reading his fiction and supernatural horror and literature and adopting the conception of cosmic horror that Lovecraft develops there. You'll see a rapid transition to Lovecraft's use of the phrase. Clifford's ambiguous cosmic emotion then was resolved by Gould in his writings into cosmic horror. Gould's formulation was popular in medical, philosophical, and theological literature from the mid-1890s through to at least 1910, and to some degree thereafter. In 1910 saw the publication of his essay collection, The Infinite Presence, which builds on his earlier work, The Meaning and Method of Life, and adds a sort of capstone to a lot of Gould's natural theological and vitalistic ideas. A little bit of information about Gould himself. Gould grew up in Athens, Ohio. He was a drummer boy during the Civil War, and he served in the 63rd Regiment of the Ohio Volunteers, and later volunteered in the 141st Ohio Volunteers Infantry. And his experiences during the Civil War surely shaped his later views and his decision to practice medicine. He studied at the Harvard Divinity School and for a time worked as the owner of a bookstore and left it to study medicine at Jefferson College, graduating in 1889 at the age of 40, at which point he immediately opened an ophthalmology office in Philadelphia, where his clients would include one Ezra Loomis, later better known as the poet Ezra Pound. Gould brought an interest in literary matters and publishing to the literature of medicine and edited the journal Medical News for 5 years, the Philadelphia Medical Journal for a couple of years, and the journal American Medicine for 5 years. And during his career, many of the offices and honors bestowed upon him were based on his accomplishments as a medical lexicographer. His medical dictionaries sold more than 500,000 copies, and he was also a prolific author of literary works, including poetry and a biography of Lafcadio Hearn, the writer that Lovecraft also praises as a precursor to modern weird fiction in supernatural horror and literature. And an excerpt from Gould's study of Lafcadio Hearn's life and work helps illuminate Gould's very particular views about the relationship between art and physiology. Hearn, according to Gould, was no product of his environment. In a certain sense, he was of the school of Flaubert, Gautier, Maupassant, Loti, and Zola, but with such differences that these teachers may not take much credit to themselves. The distinctive dominating force which controlled and created Hearn's literary makings, his morbid vision, and Gould uses this term in a very literal sense. For him, the optical system is an externalization of the brain and thus a manifestation of the mind itself. The eyes for Gould are very much like the phallus, the penis for Freud. There's a kind of over-determination resting on this organ, a kind of profound privileging of vision going well beyond that has historically been normative in Western philosophy. Gould was for a time friends and an epistolary collaborator with Hearn, and claims in his book on Hearn that he was instrumental in encouraging Hearn to relocate permanently to Japan. Gould writes, his going into utter illogical and absurd captivity to the atheistic and materialistic philosophy of Herbert Spencer was a sorry sacrifice of his nobler office and better destiny to the fate that relentlessly dogged his footsteps. He was forced into all the humanity and beneficence possible to him by Japanese restraint, art, and truth. Gould seems to have understood Hearn as being in some ways characteristic of his age and representative of its illnesses, an assessment linked to his understanding of literary decadence and entropy as relating to the optical damage done by urbanized and industrialized capitalist society at the turn of the 20th century, and his many biographical clinical studies of writers and thinkers from De Quincey to Darwin to Nietzsche really flog this horse, trying to make a case that each of these thinkers had their thought profoundly inflected by particular problems with their vision, with their eyesight. Gould writes, a new pathology of genius is coming into view, which shows the morbidizing of art and literature through disease, chiefly of the sense organs of the artist and the literary workman, but also by unnatural living, selfishness, sin, and the rest. And you begin to get a sense of how he folds his own Christian views into his writings on nature, on natural history. He really is in this tradition, this 18th and 19th century tradition of natural theology. As an ophthalmologist, Gould is remembered for a career detecting errors of refraction to aid in relieving eye strain, from which he himself suffered. When James Joyce complained to Ezra Pound of the great pain his eye strain caused, Pound offered to forward his complaints to Gould as the presiding expert in such conditions at the time. And Gould's biographical clinics conclude that the poor health of many influential people was a result of the damage to their eye, the strain of the eye. For Gould, the eye was best understood as an externalization of the brain into the world, and he pushed this connection of literal vision to rational thought to extremes. The eyes for Gould, much like the penis for his equally Ernst Haeckel-influenced contemporary Freud, really seem to be the root of human behavior and the problems with human thought and perception. Gould first uses the term cosmic horror in his 1893 study, A Search for Religion in Biology, the Meaning and Method of Life. Here he writes, I have learned that many another sensitive, despairing soul, in the face of the glib creeds and loneliness of subjectivity, has also and often felt the same clutching spasm of cosmic horror, the very heart of life stifled and stilled with an infinite fear and sense of lostness. But Gould would continue to use the phrase cosmic horror in this context throughout the remainder of his writings, often memorializing it in his medical dictionaries and works of medical lexicology. And he continued to identify it with a supposedly pathological inability to recognize the vitalic divine force inherent in life itself, which in The Meaning and Method of Life he terms biologos. A few passages from The Meaning and Method of Life that give a sense of the scope of Gould's thought at this time, and some of the interesting parallels and contrasts between it and both Lovecraft's critical writings and his fictions. Gould maintained that he basically advocated a kind of panspermic explanation for the origins of life on Earth. Life came from elsewhere. He writes, beyond all doubt, not matter born, but matter taming, biologos came to our planet from without, whether gaining the first foothold by means of a meteor-carried cluster of organic cells, or whether such an elementary organism were nursed and fanned into activity in the warm ooze of some tropic shore, matters not. Life's organizing architectonic force is so profoundly unlike any mechanical force that the materialist of our day can only command our sincere pity for his congenital atrophy of perception. Again, Gould suggests that it's literal problems with vision, problems with the ability to see, with the eyes, that lead to this supposedly myopic materialism. He writes, a frank and free vision sees as the most certain of all facts a purposive and intelligent power, life, using and dominating a wholly alien, unsympathetic, and changeless material, physical substance, and no mental ingenuity can imagine either as derived from the other. Gould absolutely rejected the idea of abiogenesis. Like many 18th and 19th century thinkers, he did not think that life could emerge from unliving or dead matter. And in this regard, his work harks back to a lot of early 19th century natural philosophers, such as those that Mary Shelley was drawing on in her early Gothic novel, Frankenstein. He was also an avid proponent of Ernst Haeckel's biological and philosophical thought. Phylogeny is the repetition of ontogeny, a formulation also very beloved of Freud, who used it to try to establish connections between the development of the individual consciousness and the development of humanity as a species. According to Gould, is a maxim based on inexpugnable fact. Gould was tremendously hostile to Spencer's evolutionary views, Herbert Spencer's evolutionary views. And Lovecraft's critique of Spencer and Gould's critiques of Spencer really take very polar opposite positions. According to Gould, Spencer's unworthy and fallacious attempt to smudge over the marks of difference between phenomena that are purely mechanical and those that are metamechanical, in other words, vitalic, pertaining to life, however necessary to his theory, is good intellect wasted in a bad cause. He also would become an advocate for eugenics. He developed a kind of theology in which biologos, which he identified with divinity, with God, was a limited, struggling power working against recalcitrant materials, and it was incumbent on human beings to join this divinity, to partner with the biologos, to improve the conditions of life, to extend the dominion of life over the realm of dead matter, of unliving mechanism. And for him, this would also include by the elimination of those who were tremendously sick, seriously disabled, idiots in his formulation. And it's here that Gould's work as a medical lexicographer and his accumulation of atypical bodies in curiosities of and anomalies of medicine really visibly shapes his views and his outcomes. He could not reconcile deformity. He could not reconcile the whole catalog of abnormalities that are accumulated in that work with belief in a perfect and an omnipotent divinity. And this led him to this vitalistic philosophy of biologos. Future sociology and government, Gould insisted, must undertake a certain ordering and regulation of the reproductive function so that human beings could become partners with this conception of the divine, partners with this biologos. God is waiting to turn the task over to man. Physical forces are reigned and ruled, Gould insisted, by intelligent design. So, very vocal and influential late 19th and early 20th century proponent of intelligent design. The control of matter and its aimless forces is the summarization of the primary function of both God and man. Gould's biologos was an idea that was often taken up by other writers through to the 1920s, and you can see here his continuing critique of Herbert Spencer. Spencer's answer consists in placing the prestidigitators foulard of infinite time and infinite numbers of progressive stages over the trick of creation. Like many advocates of intelligent design, Gould did not believe that the Earth was old enough, that the organic compounds in Earth were old enough to have created the complexity of life. Thus, this whole strangely Neoplatonic idea that it came from without. You can hear a lot of echoes in Gould's vitalistic philosophy of the kind of Neoplatonism that Milton drew on in Paradise Lost, for example. God working from the raw stuff of chaos to create a cosmos, an ordered and an organized world. This slide again draws on Google Ngram to show some of the range that Gould's term biologos, this fusion of biology with logos, right? And it has this tremendously Christian inflection, as in the beginning of the book of John there, logos, in the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. But this was a concept that Gould, really influentially disseminated through many of his works, and you can find references to it in a wide variety of writings through to at least the late 1920s. So the odds that Lovecraft had come across it at some point were, very, very high. A couple of examples from Gould's writing of his use of this term. The left hand of the slide shows a page from Gould's Illustrated Dictionary of Medicine, Biology, and Allied Sciences, a widely used reference work from the 1890s, which includes a definition of biologos, a designation proposed for the intelligent living power displayed in cellular and organic action and reaction. So Gould used his considerable influence as the most widely read medical lexicographer of his day to advance his own creationist philosophical views. His accumulation of medical anomalies was a decisive influence on his conception of biologos as a constrained deity, a not entirely omnipotent, although benevolent God figure, working with difficult materials and requiring the cooperation of his human creations to complete the vitalization of dead matter and mechanical nature. As Gould's 1904 essay, The Infinite Presence, states, only for a short instance, at best, will most persons consent to look open-eyed at any clear image of fate or infinity, since the freezing of the heart that follows, the appalling shudder at the dread contemplation of infinity, which may be called cosmic horror, is more than can be endured. If those stars are absolutely and positively infinite, then there is no up or down, and they knew no beginning. They will have no ending. With any such staring gorgon of fatalism, the surcharged attention is shaken. And it's only by a kind of transformation of this cosmic horror into wonder, by an embrace of the biologos, by an acceptance of this task to take on the life-generative activity of divinity, that this cosmic horror can be overcome, according to Gould. Gould asks, why may not this cosmic horror be turned into cosmic pleasure? It's not bravery or athletic prowess. At worst, it is a psychic want of equilibrium, a morbid metaphysics. Gould concludes that those who exercise a moral intuition of the biologos, of this infinite presence, have accomplished a stage on a journey to ecstatic elevation. Quote, the horror is from disuse of the innate power, and the sublimest pleasure may be found in excursions into the infinite. For Gould, cosmic horror is only a base material that man's sense of law sublimates by a kind of affective alchemy into an elevated, ceaseless awe. The inability to reach sublime pleasure he equates with a morbid metaphysics, a medico-theological recapitulation of the Kantian sublime with a Spencerian twist that Lovecraft's cosmic horror turns on its head. This slide contains an excerpt from Theodore Dreiser's 1915 novel, The Genius, and it just shows Dreiser's main character here, Eugene, the lustful painter, turning to Gould as one of the many sources as one of the many sources of a kind of vitalistic counter-philosophy to the mechanistic universe of Spencer that he finds so horrifying. And Dreiser acknowledged that this was a profoundly autobiographical book in many ways, and often wrote about the kind of cosmic horror with which he experienced reading Herbert Spencer as a young man. Quite different from Lovecraft's reaction to Herbert Spencer. Lovecraft's certainty that Spencer did not go nearly far enough, that he maintained too many parochial Victorian vitalistic sensibilities in his work and in his thought. I have encountered no evidence that Lovecraft had firsthand knowledge of Gould's writings, and certainly S.T. Joshi has stated in a personal email that if Lovecraft had known Gould, he would have abhorred his natural theology, and this is absolutely, I'm sure, true. However, Lovecraft's conception of cosmic horror can, I think, nevertheless better be understood as a reaction to the meaning the phrase cosmic horror had come to have in the first decades of the 20th century due to Gould's popularization of it. Lovecraft is reterritorializing, if you will, a kind of bespoke phrase and idea in his conception of cosmic horror. In an exchange with Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock in The Age of Lovecraft, China Mieville locates Lovecraft within a visionary and ecstatic tradition, which is part of a break contemporaneous with the First World War. This break offers, according to Mieville, a shattering of representation that gives rise to modernist literature, a kind of terrible, terrible sublime, in his words. Gould's cosmic horror exemplifies what what Mieville calls the nostrums of a kind of late Victorian bourgeois culture, where Lovecraft's conception becomes also, in Mieville's words, the most pure and vivid expression of that moment when such nostrums become unsustainable. In a 1934 letter to R.H. Barlow, Lovecraft claims, quote, "The seat of the pleasure of the weird is certainly tremendously obscure. My own view is that tales of the supernatural give one a sense of a greatly expanded ego." However, this sense of expansion for Lovecraft is not linked, as it is for example, Anne Radcliffe or Immanuel Kant or George Milbury Gould, to a moral intuition or intimation of divinity, whether one attributes this to a kind of vitalistic principle, the biologos, as Gould does, or a categorical intuition, as Kant does, what T.S. Eliot called a semi-ethical criterion. Rather, Lovecraft understands it as dependent on an apparent and momentary, quote, "conquest of the galling limitations of time, space, and natural law." While admitting that may be only part of the story, it would hardly explain why the terrible is preferred to other forms of the supernatural, end quote. In his 1933 essay, Notes on Writing Weird Fiction, Lovecraft returns to supernatural horror in literature's opening sentence to explain the lure of the terrible. Quote, "These stories frequently emphasize the element of horror because fear is our deepest and strongest emotion and the one which best lends itself to the creation of nature-defying illusions," end quote. George Gould or William James would assume probably that the atheistic Lovecraft's morbid metaphysics prevented his conversion of cosmic horror into cosmic pleasure, and certain theoreticians and scholars interested in and interpreting Lovecraft's work have agreed with this assessment. Vivian Relicas, for example, understands cosmic horror in terms of Julia Kristeva's psychoanalytic conception of abjection in Les Pouvoirs d'Horreur, and posits that Lovecraft's cosmic horror is much closer to Kristevan abjection than to sublimity as it was understood by most 18th and 19th century thinkers. If that's true, it would lead us to expect a jolt of jouissance or a kind of ego-dystonic disgust in Lovecraft's reaction to the works of cosmic horror that he praises and that he would attempt to produce in his own writings. Lovecraft, however, manifestly found ego-expansive enjoyment in the cosmic horror fictions that he canonized, and he sought to produce something similar in those he wrote. And it's in this fusion of horror with sublimity that Lovecraft's mutation of cosmic horror from Gould's earlier Victorian conception of cosmic horror becomes most visible. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Sean, for your presentation, for your video. Lots of information for sure. One question: Can you hear me? Because I'm not sure about it. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So thanks one again, Sean. Once again, and now I believe it's William's turn. Is it right?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, let me get your file because we have a file on all of you. William Perpetua Bush from Brazil, representing Universidade Federal do Paraná. I probably said that all wrong. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
So, if you're ready to start, we are ready to listen.
Very well. My proposal is to understand this concept of Lovecraftian, because Lovecraft is like everywhere, and it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what we are talking about, and what difference, and if there is any sort of difference between Lovecraft work, the Cthulhu mythos, as mentioned before, and the Lovecraftian itself. So a concept that I use, it's called hyperstation. Hyperstation was created by a group in 1995 called CCRU Crew, which means Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. And this concept says basically this: hyperstations are fictions that can make themselves real. And this group in itself was deeply inspired in Lovecraft's work. And my idea is that we can understand the notion of Lovecraftian as a hyperstation itself. I'm going to try to pinpoint some of these aspects and what we can gain by doing this. For example, we just have an amazing piece explaining to us about the Cthulhu mythos by Josefa. And in the case of August Derleth, what we have is someone that tried to control the Lovecraftian in his own terms. This was done by the Arkham House. But before Derleth, we need to understand that Lovecraft work was always something done by other people. There's a collaborative aspect in Lovecraft works that we sometimes forget. It's not just the mythos, but we can see in his letters how much he cares about his other friends. He read his other friends, especially, for example, Howard. And the Lovecraftian itself is not the use itself of Cthulhu or anything related, but this network of relations that Lovecraft created. After his death, with the Cthulhu's Mythos by Derleth, there is a twist in the Lovecraftian, as Derleth himself controls not only how we should write about Lovecraft, but also how we should think about Lovecraft. Because if you see the publications from Arkham House, there are a lot of literary material, but there's also a lot of scholarship, and all that scholarship works around what Derleth believes to be what Lovecraft wanted. And we know, we saw that, as Josefa pointed out, that this was a completely distinct notion of what was going before. Lovecraft himself was not some sort of he never taught his work as a sort of Bible that the others should follow to the letter. But what August Derleth did was something of the sort. The thing is, after this hijack of the Lovecraftian hyperstation by Derleth,
there's also another thing going on. That's the science fiction itself, the field of science fiction, was also controlled by another person. That was John W. Campbell Jr. As the main editor. In that case, it is also very difficult to write science fiction that escapes Campbell author. And the same we can say for scholarship, because as Derleth controlled Lovecraft's criticism, Campbell did the same. The academics themselves could not really jumpstart something because there are just two main persons controlling the field. After the Second World War, science fiction itself started to change. There's a lot of new authors, new magazines, but only in the end of the 50s, with the creation of Extrapolation as the first academic journal that aimed to study science fiction and fantasy, which itself included the work of Lovecraft, is that a new phase in scholarship could start to take its first steps. That being said, there are very few mentions of Lovecraft work at this time. There are people writing, following the scenario of the Arkham House publisher, but in my PhD, I actually studied that process, and I think there's only two mentions of Lovecraft works in Extrapolation from 1959 to the 70s. So Lovecraft is not something that people really want to touch. By the 70s, the situation changed quite a lot because Extrapolation, which started like a journal, very homemade, actually became the Science Fiction Research Association. That is today the most important academic organization to study science fiction in the United States. Then in that same period, just a few years later, just 1 year later, Derleth died. But not only Derleth, but Campbell. So after that, the field could actually grow and new names could jump in. In 73, the academic journal Science Fiction Studies was created. They really did not want to touch Lovecraft material. They are kind of, well, Lovecraft is not something that we really want because we want science fiction, and he's not. But in 75, there is the publication of the first major biography of Lovecraft by Lion Spring de Camp, which was in his turn a very famous writer and critic of the field. And the first review of this book appeared in Science Fiction Studies. But still, it was hard to study Lovecraft, the Lovecraftian in itself. By the end of the 70s, the field of science fiction scholarship was at its full speed. There are major academic press that want to publish that material. There's a lot of books being published about it. There's like this huge boom. In that same year, unless 1 year later, in the 80s, Joshi published appeared at the first time in Science Fiction Studies in a review where he actually, his review was a response to another review that took a very bad opinion against Lovecraft, and he went in his defense. A year later, the Call of Cthulhu RPG was published. This is very important because it completely escapes the whole notion that Lovecraftian should be confined to literature. If today we have games, if today we have music or mangas or anything that is outside the field of literature, the start is with this RPG. Then we can see that the Lovecraftian so far is like this collaborative, this multiple thing that is going on. But 1995 appears this organization called CCRU that it's a very weird organization. And I could spend hours talking about this group. One of the most famous name was Nick Land, today a very problematic person. But at the time, he was very interested in Lovecraft and combined it with Deleuze and Guattari philosophy. This allowed him, and CCRU itself, to develop this notion of hyperstation, a fiction that not only was capable to make itself real, but with a twist. This fiction can actually travel in time to make itself real. So this fiction itself is a tool, this concept itself is a tool to understand its own history. And you can apply hyperstation for very different things, like theosophy, demonology, esoteric, cyberfeminism, etc. From the CCRU, we move to the speculative realism. Some of the authors and philosophers and thinkers that are involved with CCRU later publish or are somewhat related to the speculative realism. But central in the CCRU was a story that tells the following tale. A captain of the United States Army called Visparov wrote a letter to an anthropologist called Chudini Steele, explaining that he was deployed during the Second World War to the Pacific Islands to use the natives as a sort of resistance to the Japanese occupation. And to do this, he uses Steele's ethnography work. But by doing so, he started to see that there are a lot of connections between these natives, the material published by Lovecraft related to the people that worship the Great Old Ones, and the possibility that the sorcery that these natives are using are actually effective. You see, there are two things going on. The first is how the anthropology is used by the military. It's a very huge discussion that goes on since Franz Boas. And the United States did use a lot of anthropologists in the army. It still uses even today. And the second is how this field of anthropology see other types of knowledge. Because most of the time, the knowledge of the people that the anthropologist is studying is treated by a sort of minor belief, magic, something archaic, It's never taken serious as this science is. And this whole affair that results in the creation of the Cthulhu Club is to explore the idea that the boundaries between truth and false, reality and fiction, are not as stable as they appear to be. That being said, we jump to the final movement that I want to talk about. Is that during the Cthulhu Mythos phase, there are a lot of writers building on Lovecraft's work. Brian Lumley is one of those. In his works, he follows many aspects of the mythos, the entities, whatever. However, while Lovecraftian characters, like pretty much any of the protagonists of the stories, either went mad or are incapable to understand what's going on. Lumley was the first to propose the notion that there is possible to fight the great old ones, to actually establish some sort of resistance. And this is done by the use of science, by the creation of a group that is responsible to fight against the great old ones. And if you take this key that science is the main myth behind the Lovecraftian until the Weird of Halley, that I'm going to talk about in a bit, we can see that they still maintain that fiction and reality are different things. With the Weird of Halley, following what I said about the CCRU, with the Weird of Halley, we got something very different going on. The Weird of Halley is a group of books. The main story appears in 7 books, but there are at least 30, with an RPG also, that is written by John Michael Greer, which not only was a reader of Lovecraft, Derlet, and all that stuff, but he's also an occultist. He held a lot of studies about Golden Dawn, Druidism, all the esoteric stuff that you can think about. Greer has written something about. So Greer uses this framework of the Lovecraftian, but this is done in such a form that this myth of science is completely subverted. How he does that? For example, the first book of the Weird of Halley, Innsmouth, you have a main character that is actually a Lovecraftian scholar, but he treated the fiction, the materials inside the Lovecraft stories, as fiction. During the book, it's revealed that they are not fiction. They are actually real things. But the way Lovecraft presented them was filtered by this myth of progress and his racism, his opinions about race, about degeneration, about many different things, his sexism, etc. So he revisits Innsmouth, for example, but he completely twists the early definition and propose something quite different, where the people that once appeared to be the generatives are actually those who are oppressed, the subaltern, the minorities. So he can revise, criticize, and rethink the Lovecraftian. One of the most interesting example of this is that in the second book, Kingsport, he directly debates with the story called Festival that was published by Lovecraft in the Weird Tales of January 1925. In that story, you have a narrator that was invited to Kingsport to participate in a commemoration. And when he goes there, he starts to see strange things until there's a point that he starts to see flying beasts that are so horrendous, so macabre, that he flees in panic. Greer takes the story, goes back, but he does this by using a female character that allows him to discuss a lot of gender material and also explore some aspects of the esoteric and the occult that are not chained by the constraints of the myth of science and the myth of progress. I'm not going to give more spoilers than I'm already done. I really suggest to read these books because they are so good. But behind all of Greer material was the revelation that there is a group called Radiance that is responsible since ancient Greece until today to suppress, to persecute, to kill anyone who wants to work the great old ones. Because this type of worship is not constrained to the interests of colonialism, scientificism, and nationalism. Not only this, but Greer can also touch in the problem that we can see going today in the academia all around the world, that Radiance itself wants to transform the academia as something oriented only toward the market. This type of thinking, this myth of progress, wants in turn to make the academia, the colleges, universities, something that should serve only the market and nothing beyond that. So not only he discussed Lovecraft, Darlet, but he created this new Lovecraftian that is so critical, so engaging with the material that came before, but with current themes that we can discuss. So when I'm to go to my conclusions, when we think about Lovecraftian, it's as a prestition, as I suggested, it's very important that we consider its historicity. Don't rely too much on what Lovecraft wanted, but always see that there are more people involved, and there are, of course, times when someone actually took the control of it. But the idea in itself, making itself real, is so powerful that it can simply escape it and engage with contemporary questions that in such a form that attracts attention today. That is it. Thank you.
Okay, now everyone should be able to hear me. Once again, thank you very much, William. You're talking about some aspects of Lovecraftian books that I've never heard about before, actually. So very interesting. Thanks for preparing this very detailed presentation. And now let's go over to our next guest, Andres Torres Scott, who's also prepared a pre-recorded presentation about Lovecraft and Borges, Lovecraft's shadow over Borges. Andres Torres Scott is an independent scholar from Mexico. Thank you for joining us today. Would you like to say something before we play our presentation?
Mateusz, thank you very much. Well, just to thank you for the organization of this event and for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here and my pleasure to listen to all your conferences. And no, let's start it and let's talk later. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's go then. Just in a sec.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Andres Torres Scott. I'm an independent scholar from Mexico. I actually live and work here. And I would like to thank everybody, the organization committee, and especially Camila for the invitation to attend this PhilosophyCon 2021. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, in my turn, I'm going to speak about the shadow of Lovecraft over Jorge Luis Borges. The influence of this short story writer of the Lovecraftian and cosmic horror tales of the weird tale over Borges. And basically, it seems to be a very small field because Borges only wrote one short story, one cosmic horror or weird tale short story, but the difference goes beyond that. I'm going to speak first about these two authors and how their crossroads match curiously, because they have very biographical similitudes that go beyond literature. Well, first of all, Lovecraft was born on 1890, as you may know, and Borges was born on 1899, just 9 years apart. So basically they were contemporary authors. Both authors, Lovecraft and Borges, had a very close relationship with their mothers, Lovecraft in addition to his aunts, but that defined their lives in two senses. Borges lived with his mother until she was 19 and he was 70, so basically he spent more time with his mother than with a wife. Both authors got married once, then divorced with very sad remembrances of those marriages. Borges married again when he was very old, but I consider that marriage as a way to not be alone and to be cared of more than a love adventure. In addition to this personal circumstance, both authors love Edgar Allan Poe. They also like British literature from the 19th century. They love Kipling, they love H.G. Wells, they love Robert L. Stevenson, they love Coleridge. This is an incredible match because it seems that they were influenced by the same authors. In addition to the British, they also were influenced by Greek and Roman philosophy. They both love Aristotle, Plato, and they also love Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and they were also fond of the 1001 Night. They were charmed by these texts. And as a result of reading the same literature, reading the same authors in philosophy, both had the same ideas or the same recurrent themes. Both authors, Lovecraft and Borges, wrote about time, the infinitude, mirrors, books, magic and strange books, and of course, immortality. Both authors also start writing poetry when they were young. The American literary critic Barton Levy Santerman identifies this phenomenon as synchronicity. And he's taking this phenomenon from Carl Gustav Jung ideas of psychology. Two persons or with different causes have a similar result. And this is what we are having here, a deep case of synchronicity. But in addition to speaking and talking about the same issues, there's one clear crossroad between Lovecraft and Borges, and that is Borges' short story called, in English, it is the only short story that has a title in English. Borges wrote in Spanish all the time, but this is the only short story that has a title in English, and it is called There Are More Things. It was published in 1975 in Borges' anthology book, The Book of Sand, El Libro de Arena, and it includes this There Are More Things. We have a relevant question that has no clear answer yet. Where did Borges get aware of Lovecraft? What book or what books did Borges had or read from Lovecraft? This is very interesting because this goes back till 1956 when Jorge Luis Borges included Lovecraft in his university course of North American literature. We're speaking about 1956. Maybe is this the first time Lovecraft was included in a university course? On the book Borges wrote about this North American literature course, the chapter dedicated to Lovecraft is called Crime Novel, Science Fiction and the Far West. And in this chapter, Borges talked about Edgar Allan Poe, Dashiell Hammett, Ray Bradbury, and Lovecraft. If you know about an earlier time when Lovecraft was added to a university syllabus, please let me know. In this book, Borges also gives a short bio of Lovecraft and mentions three short stories by title: The Color Out of Space, The Dunwich Horror, and The Rats. In addition to that, Borges says that Lovecraft had a pathetic style and atrocious style at some point, which I believe comes from the basically long descriptions that Lovecraft used and from the overuse of adjectives, but I'm going to leave that aside. Borges adds about Lovecraft that in his tale, there are beings from remote planets and from ancient or future times who dwell in human bodies to study the universe, or inversely, souls from our time that during a sleep explore monstrous worlds, distant in time and in space. But he does not mention any specific short stories that deal with this theme. My bet is that Borges read Lovecraft not from the pulp fiction magazines, but that he got one of the 3 volumes published by Arkham House, possibly Beyond the World of Sleep from 1943, The Dunwich Horror and Others from 1963, or Dagon and Other Macabre Tales from 1965. My bet is that he got the first volume, Beyond the World of Sleep. Even though Borges only identifies by title 3 works from Lovecraft, from his saying that Lovecraft uses in his tales this theme about an alien occupying a human mind, we may argue that he is referring to The Shadow Out of Time, Beyond the World of Sleep, and The Call of Cthulhu. Furthermore, from the biographical notes that Borges mentions about Lovecraft, we may also infer that he had one of the books published by Arkham. And hence, my best bet is that Borges had the Dunwich Horror and Others, the best supernatural stories of H.P. Lovecraft, published on 1963. Because on that volume, we identify the 3 stories he mentioned by title: The Rats in the Walls, The Color Out of Space, The Dunwich Horror, The Call of Cthulhu, and The Shadow Out of Time. However, there's the issue here that in this volume it is not included the introduction to supernatural horror in literature, which I also believe he read. In addition to Lovecraft's mention in Borges' course, Borges mentioned Lovecraft 4 more times in different interviews. These interviews were carried out from 1968 to 1977, and they were done by American literary critics and writers. And it does not cease to surprise me that when Borges talked to Richard Bergin, William Goldhurst, Paul Theroux, and Willis Barnstone, all of them later will become American literary critics, famous literary American critics. And Borges asked these 4 people, "Do you know Lovecraft?" And all of them affirm they have never heard about Lovecraft. And these interviews are written by these 4 people. So we're having here a Latin American fiction author in the South Cone in Buenos Aires who knows more about North American literature than literary critics in the 60s and 70s. These 4 interviews took place in English and were published by the authors, so you can access them very easily on the web. Synthesize Borges' opinions on Lovecraft's literary work. First, Lovecraft was influenced by Poe and by Machen, by Arthur Machen. Second, Lovecraft's style was interjective and atrocious. Third, Lovecraft had Edgar Allan Poe's imagination. Fourth, Lovecraft didn't write the finest story in the world. Sorry guys, he didn't. Fifth, his images are awful, but the feeling isn't awful. Sixth, Lovecraft's plots are very good. And seventh, and this is a matter of taste, I like Lovecraft's horror stories the same as I do, and I may say the same as you do. Basically, Borges liked Lovecraft's writing, and that's why he decided to write a short story in the memory of H.P. Lovecraft. Well, now let's go deeper into There Are More Things. There Are More Things, as Ricardo Piglia, a literary critic, affirms, tells 2 stories. There's a visible story that hides a secret tale. The secret tale is narrated in an elliptic and fragmentary mode. For Borges, story 1 is a genre, in this case, this is a weird tale. The second story is always the theme, and the theme here is Berkeley's idealism embedded under a cosmic horror tale. Of course, I'm going to go with more depth into the first, on the visible story, the story that is a homage to H.P. Lovecraft. We may start with a paratextual analysis of the short story There Are More Things by analyzing the title, the dedication, and the afterword. According to Borges specialist Rafael Olea, There Are More Things title comes from Hamlet when he addresses Horatio. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Now let's go to the dedication. This is a strange dedication. It says, to the memory of H.P. Lovecraft. This is the only short story Borges dedicated to the memory of, instead of dedicating it to an actual person. Borges says that a dedication is an arcane mystery. In addition, in his poem Los Conjurados, he says, ¿Qué misterio es una dedicatoria? Una entrega de símbolos. What a mystery a dedication is, delivering symbols. Third, this short story, There Are More Things, is the only one in which Borges tries to write someone else. He wrote in the afterword of the Book of Psalms, life, which everyone knows is inscrutable, left me no peace until I perpetrated a posthumous story by H.P. Lovecraft. In the end I gave in. The lamentable fruit is entitled There Are More Things. So Borges is saying he wasn't too good to create a Lovecraft story, and at the same time he's saying he wrote a story by H.P. Lovecraft. So what is Borges doing here? Well, Borges is using this idea by French philosopher Ronald Barthes about the authorship. Ronald Barthes says, to give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signifier, to close the writing. When the author has been found, the text is explained. But what is doing Borges here by saying that he perpetrated a posthumous story by Lovecraft, he is enclosing the limits and he's saying, I'm going to write a weird tale, and I'm going to write a weird tale as if I were Lovecraft, and I'm going to try to comply with every aspect Lovecraft tried to promote in order to create this weird tale. Now, let's see what elements, what characteristics appear on There Are More Things that belong to a weird tale. I think the most relevant characteristics exposed by Lovecraft in his introduction to supernatural horror in literature appear in Borges' There Are More Things. First, the atmosphere. As Lovecraft said, the atmosphere is the all-important thing. As for the final criterion of authenticity is not dovetailing of a plot, but the creation of a given sensation. And Borges enormously focuses to create this atmosphere, give a hint. There must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain. So the hint here is that since the very beginning we are aware that something is gonna happen in this short story. Supernatural, this is the third characteristic, of course, a particular suspension of the laws of nature, and we're gonna see these two at the very end of There Are More Things. The fourth characteristic is the unknown forces that must be present, unpredictability, because a weird tale also takes us to the unforeseen. The sixth element is danger, because the unknown, the unpredictable, imply, when they are gathered together, danger. If we do not know something and we know something that is not predictable, Lovecraft said, an unknown world is a world of peril and evil. Seventh, evil. Why evil? Because after the unknown, the unpredictable, and the danger, the only reason we can be afraid is because we believe that what we are gonna find is evil. And finally, the irrational or the unreal phenomena. There Are More Things starts with a man going to the furthest place in the continent, el confín remoto del continente. This is a characteristic of the American Gothic story. No? We're going to move to a place where we are alone and a place that is far away from the urban centers. The protagonist, that has no name stated, arrives to Turdera and starts doing a research on who bought his uncle's property and what is happening inside there. Then we have a very philosophical mention, Hinton Cubes, H.G. Wells, and a dog called Samuel Johnson. This dog appeared decapitated in the middle of a road. This kill dog appeared in Lovecraft tale The Whisper in Darkness. The place that the protagonist visit is called Casa Colorada, the Red House, possibly an allusion to the horror at Red Hook by Lovecraft. The red color always gives us the sense of danger. This house is surrounded by water and it is isolated, so this adds up an atmosphere of loneliness and, of course, danger. Casa Colorada has a tower with a cloak and adds that this tower oppresses the walls and the windows in a clear allusion to the music of Eric Sand, where Lovecraft explicitly mentions that the street show oppressive buildings coming together. When we approach to the Casa Colorada, we find a couple of allusions to the Dunwich Horror, as the windows are boarded up. There are also dogs around the house, as it happens in The Whisper in Darkness and the Dunwich Horror. And this also happened in the case of Charles Dexter Ward. The protagonist is then trying to find out who bought the house and what modifications were done inside it. And closes one of the paragraphs saying, La abominación tiene muchas formas. Abomination has many forms, giving us a hint that something not good is gonna happen. Then Borges has 3 dialogues with 3 people around the Casa Colorada, just as it happens in the Lovecraftian tale, The Sean House. The people is afraid. The people says there's something evil inside, but they do not say what they believe there is inside. After having these 3 unproductive dialogues, the protagonist goes home. He reads Schopenhauer. Who reads Schopenhauer after a mystery book? He has a dream. This dream is also a recurrent trope or motive in Lovecraft's tales, just as the rats in the walls, the dreams in the witch house, and the Sean house. But the dream the protagonist has is supernatural. Of course, as every dream, Lovecraft may say. On this dream, the protagonist sees a Piranesi etching. Piranesi mostly draw etchings of Roman remains. And there then he perceives a monster. This was not a bull, this was a bison. Lying on the land, the body seemed to sleep and dream. Borges is depicting here a dream in which the Minotaur, instead of having a bull's head, has a bison head. Here, Borges is Americanizing Greek mythology. This scene is also an allusion to famous Lovecraft short story, The Pigman's Model, and the Dunwich Horror. In that story, Pigman's Model, Lovecraft mentions Gustave Doré, Sidney H. Syme, Anthony Angarola, Francisco Goya, and Henry Fuseli, and compares these authors to Richard Upton Pickman. Finally, after the dream, the protagonist gets out and starts walking around, and he suddenly realizes it's already night. This trope of walking in the night is something that appears in The Outsider, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and The Rats in the Walls. The protagonist sees a light and hears a sound coming from inside the house. Then a sudden and unexpected storm begins, just as in Lovecraft tale The Picture in the House. After lightning strikes, the protagonist enters the house. This is also an allusion from Lovecraft's tale The Picture in the House, where the protagonist can see a house after a lightning strikes. And just as in The Picture in the House, the door is ajar. Then we have more subtle references. In There Are More Things, the protagonist identifies un olor dulce y nauseabundo, a sweet and nauseating odor. This may be an allusion to the nameless odor that appeared in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, or as Lovecraft said, a faint but peculiar hateful odor. There's also nauseating odors in the Dreams in the Witch House and the Sean House. In addition to that treble final odor in The Outsider, where the protagonist faces a fetid apparition. The day the protagonist entered the house, and this is the first time we see a date in this short story, is January 19th. You know what happens on January 19th? No? Well, that's Edgar Allan Poe's birthday, so this is the day you can enter a haunted house. The protagonist thus enters the house and starts wandering inside, and he starts seeing a lot of things, but Borges said, to see something, you should understand it. And he is not understanding what he's looking at. Then suddenly he looks at the stairs with irregular holes. These stairs do not seem to be human. Is this an allusion to the shadow out of time and the buildings, or to the body found in the case of Charles Dexter Ward? I think it definitely is. The stairs are not for any use for a human or an animal. I didn't hear a sound, but the presence of incomprehensible things made me feel uncanny. Then the protagonist faces a table in a U shape. What is this? Finally, Borges uses a technique that Lovecraft basically created and perfected through his short stories, mostly in The Color Out of Space, The Dunwich Horror, and The Shadow Out of Time, and this technique is making some rhetoric questions before the ending of the short story. Borges does the same here. How will the inhabitant look like? What would he be looking for in this planet? What would this be less or more atrocious for him than for us? From what secret regions of astronomy or the time? Or from what incalculable time would he be coming? And how would he have reached this South American place in this precise night? So Borges is basically saying that this is a weird tale and that what he is gonna face is a supernatural cosmic horror. Even in the last paragraph of the short story, Borges keeps developing the atmosphere. He says, I felt like an intruder within the chaos. Outside, the storm had finished. I looked at my watch. I was astonished to find out it was 2 o'clock. I left the light on and started descending. I tried to get out before the inhabitant came back. I just thought that I couldn't have locked the doors because I didn't know how to do it. The monster, finally, I'm not going to tell you how this ends up, but the monster never appears, and this is something Lovecraft did, and with a great skill in some of his short stories, particularly in The Music of Erikson, where the monster never appears, Pigman's Model, where we cannot see the monster, and The Dunwich Horror, where the monster is invisible. I think this is one of the greatest homage to H.P. Lovecraft. At the end, Borges described the monster as something opresivo, lento y plural. Borges describes this monster as something, algo que ascendía por la rampa, something ascending by the ramp, oppressive, slow, plural. 3 adjectives, and these 3 adjectives are Borges' homage to Lovecraft interjective style, to this very, very charged style that some people do not like. I personally am not fond of a style of Lovecraft full of adjectives, but with 3 abstract, tangible adjectives, oppressive, slow, and plural, Borges is doing another homage to Lovecraft's style. I'm going to finish by saying a phrase that Borges said about Lovecraft. I like his horror short stories. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Andres. Yet another aspect of Lovecraftian literature that
Thank
I
you,
had no
guys.
idea about. Very, very interesting. And so we're way over time. This panel was the longest panel in this whole conference, but discussion is in order. First, we would like to give you, our guests, a chance to ask on another questions. Maybe there were aspects of some presentations that you're interested in. So if anybody has a question for anybody else, go ahead.
I actually have questions for everyone, I think.
Okay, that's fine.
I promise I'm gonna be brief. Josefa, how do you see the incursion of Christianity that Derlet had done in the mythos, this duality between good and evil? Why do you think this was so important to him, and why do you think this is responsible to twist so much what Lovecraft originally was aiming for?
Well, it was an interesting information I found in S.T. Josh's book about Lovecraft, where he states that Derleth was a practicing Christian, and it is, in my opinion, it is actually his simply misunderstanding of Lovecraft's intention, of the basic idea that he, as an atheist himself, Lovecraft, that he created a world where the good and the evil doesn't exist, where I think Derleth didn't understand the concept where the good and the evil is only a creation of humans, and where it is not universally working system. So I believe that this is the core of the misunderstanding of Derleth's further misleading of the Cthulhu mythos as he perceived it. So did I answer the question?
Yeah, you did. Thank you. Alvaro, what I really like to ask about you, but it's more like a curiosity, is that, do you see any connections between the aesthetics of cyberpunk with Lovecraftian horror in the manga, in the Japanese universe?
Yeah,
itself.
Because
yeah.
Yes, there are some. The issue is that I'm not an expert on cyberpunk, so I wouldn't like to mislead you in the sense that science fiction is different from cyberpunk, and I may confuse both in terms of manga, in the context of manga. But yes, there are many mangas belonging to this genre, either to science fiction or to cyberpunk. Actually, one, I think there's been a recent adaptation into film, which is Battle Angel Alita. That's cyberpunk, I think. Apple Seed, Omega, even Akira, up to a certain extent, do have many cyberpunk features, let's say. So yes, I actually encourage you to search that, because there are many, not only mangas, though I'm more into manga, but there are many Japanese artworks that do belong to cyberpunk. Yeah, in video games, recently cyberpunk, though that's not Japanese, I think, cyberpunk 2077, the video game, but there are many Japanese artworks belonging to that. Yeah. Did I
Yeah, great, thank you. I was thinking in some sort of, if there is any form where this Lovecraftian horror actually meets the technology of the cyberpunk.
Yes. For example, in Junji Ito, in Geo, there's a combination of both actually, because the antagonist, let's say, is a math scientist, and that there's some scientific background there. There's a scientific invention, as in science fiction, causing the whole dystopian events. And that's combined with horror in the sense of Lovecraft. Yes, there are some, that's much more specific, but for instance, that comes to my mind now, in Zio, you do have this combination between Lovecraft and horror, and let's say a novum, as Darko Subin would say, in the sense that you invent something scientific, and that invention becomes the cause of the troubles,
Thank you. This brings me to the question that I want to make to Marland, because you mentioned in your book that there's this cosmopolitical aura that fueled Lovecraft, that is pretty much in the case of immigration and mechanization. So I think it's very hard to mix these two things: mechanics, technologic, any sort of hardware, with the Lovecraftian horror itself, without making it something that is already in itself. I don't know if I'm clear on this, but I think there's a sort of a posture. Either you take a scientific position, or either you take it as something that you are incapable of knowing, and there's any sort of middle term.
I don't know that I would agree with that. I think that, and I want to make a distinction between, mechanism in terms of Lovecraft's ontology, right? His perception of nature and of reality in terms of mechanistic materialism, and technologization, right? And the social effects of technology, because those for Lovecraft are obviously they're intertwined, but they're very different areas of concern. And he has a very different kind of emotional response to each of those things. But one thing that sprung to mind with your question was the way in which he uses alien biotechnology, which is mistakenly misunderstood by human beings as being some kind of magic or divine force, as a recurring trope in many of his fictions. And at the Mountains of Madness, for example, right, the fashioning of the Shoggoths by the Old Ones, which is sort of at the crux of Dyer's discovery in that story. I think that there you have a kind of conflation between Lovecraft's mechanistic philosophy and his concerns around the social and cultural effects of technologization. I think there are aspects in Lovecraft's thought that come through, especially in his letters, that parallel the concerns that a philosopher like Walter Benjamin has for the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, for example. And so even though there is a biological aspect to Lovecraft's alien terrors, they're also a kind of technologization, and in that story, that becomes quite explicit, that the Shoggoth were created to serve the great old ones. There's a kind of vicious allegorization of the slave trade installed into those characters. And I think in terms of your earlier question to Alvaro, and I'm glad that he mentioned Akira in that regard, but I think Otomo is playing with a very similar idea there in terms of the technologization of the human mind, the human brain, and this is a kind of fusion of body horror and technology. Science fiction in a sense that is predicated on the dangers of technology, the consequences of technology, which is where cyberpunk is typically rooted as well, that you can definitely see in some of Lovecraft's stories, tongue-in-cheekly in Herbert West, and much more seriously and soberly and systematically developed in At the Mountains of Madness. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thank you. Actually, this brings me to my my question to Andres, because I got in touch with this story that Borges wrote about Lovecraft when I was discussing how hard it was to define Lovecraft inside the science fiction using the framework of the 70s, especially dark soothing, because it simply, you can't put the speculative realism in the chains of fantasy or in the chains of science fiction. Borges always go beyond that. But for me, what I found most interesting is that there is a connection in Borges' work between knowing and seeing, remembering and seeing. Like you have characters that are incapable of forgetting, incapable of remembering. He himself with his problem, personal problems with his eyes, but the way that he handles the thing, the Lovecraftian thing, is based in the perception itself, but in such a manner that is not only knowledge that is put to the test, but perception in itself is questioned. It's like Borges go so far beyond Lovecraft in that sense that you're not even, not only you are incapable of knowing, you're capable of even perceiving it because it breaks your perception. So if you can talk a bit more about that.
Oh, yes, you just nail it, because as I said on the conference, the short story for Borges has two main lines. One is a Lovecraftian tale, and the other is a theme. And this theme, in this case, is Berkeley's idealism. So what Borges is doing across the short story is telling a debate between Berkeley's idealism and Locke's materialism, or even Samuel Johnson materialism. There's a very popular anecdote in the English language by Samuel Johnson and his biographer. Can't recall the name of Samuel Johnson's biographer, but Samuel Johnson was is still, I think that together with Harold Bloom, the most famous or the most admired literary critic in the English language. So on this anecdote, Samuel Johnson is trying, someone comments to Samuel Johnson what he thinks about Berkeley's idealism, and Samuel Johnson just kick a stone and say, that's what I think about idealism. So by kicking the stone, he's saying that practically idealism does not exist, that we are all matter and only material things are relevant. So now we go back to the story. And yes, what Borges is trying to do here, there are more things on the other story, not on the Lovecraftian text, but on the underlying text, is debating between materialism and idealism. And at the middle of the story, the protagonist tells us that one of the dogs of the former owner of the Casa Colorada, the place where everything is happening, has been decapitated. And this dog's name was Samuel Johnson. So ironically, or paradoxically, a Lovecraftian monster made only of ideas, just as Berkeley's idealism, kills or decapitates a dog named Samuel Johnson, such as the famous British literary critic. And just as Samuel Johnson kicked the stone 400 years ago, this dog is decapitated by a Lovecraftian idealistic monster created on a tale by Borges. So it's a joke, but still a very intellectual joke, where you have to have read Shakespeare, Samuel Johnson, Berkeley's idealism, Borges, and then find Locke's materialism, and then realize why Borges is playing with this, because as you very smart identify, the monster here is only a slow. Slow, plural, and Borges describes it with 3 adjectives, but it is slow and plural. So what is that? That's just an idea. And that is initially what Berkeley's philosophy of idealism stated, that you cannot know the material things, you can only know qualities that are understood by your intellect, such as slow and plural. So thank you for the question. You just nailed it, William.
Thank you for your answer.
So, thank you. And does any of you have some other questions to each other? Or if so, then please ask, because we will after that read questions from the chat, because there are some.
I'd quickly like to ask Andres if you've seen any connections, Andres, between Borges' El Aleph and August Derleth's The Lamp of Al-Ashred, this story belonging to the expanded circle of Lovecraft, because it's been even pointed out as an influence. That Lovecraft influenced Borges for creating El Aleph, but if you see the dates of publication, The Lamp of Al-Ashred, I think it was published in 1957, and El Aleph is previous. El Aleph was published 8 years before or something like that. So have you seen, in the sense that there's this idea of the universe, the whole universe contained within a little ball or something like that? Is there something that ring a bell on you?
Alvaro, you just, that's another point that is very debatable between Borges and Lovecraft, and you just nailed it again. All this theory that the Aleph is based on the lamp of Al-Hazred, which is not a Lovecraftian tale. I think it's a Derleth. That's by Derleth, only from taking 1 or 2 sentences, according to ST, to Joshi, from a letter that Lovecraft wrote to him. So there was a mistake by Juan José Barrientos, a Mexican scholar, in the 80s. I believe he was doing his PhD in the Sorbonne, and he wrote an article saying that the Aleph had some influences from the lamp of Al-Hazred, and even though the Aleph was written before the lamp of Al-Hazred. So Juan José Barrientos wrote this article. The article is still on the internet and is very famous, and it's been cited a lot of times. I think that Barrientos' article is the most cited article dealing with Borges and Lovecraft. So what I did is I wrote an email to Barrientos, and he said, yes, I was wrong, and I have been publishing that, but nobody seems to listen. And Barrientos even sent me a book, which is around here. I don't have it. But he says it was my mistake, but it was not my intention. I committed a mistake. Everybody has mistakes in his life, and he committed that mistake, which created what we may call a post-truth. No, and that's the point. I may share with you the personal letter Barrientos wrote to me, the personal email. It will be a pleasure. I'm going to ask him. I'm sure he's not going to have any issues with that. And that was a mistake, and many people believes that because the article where he points out that the Aleph comes from the lamp of Al-Hazrid is more famous than his other article where he says he made a mistake. But great point.
Great, thanks. I didn't know that. Thanks.
Okay.
Sorry. I did just quickly want to ask Alvaro, in an interview with, and because I find the way that Junji Ito has transformed, aspects of Lovecraft's work so fascinating. He commented that what he found most intriguing about Lovecraft's work was his expressionism in terms of atmosphere. So I was just wondering what you thought of that, what you thought he meant by that, and how you see that reflected in Ito's work.
Yeah, there's actually a remarkable fact about that. It's the fact that Junji Ito's stories are very particular in the sense that they don't have either a turn on events or even a conclusion. The typical story is integrated by introduction, development, turn of events, and conclusion. And Junji Ito omits those two final steps, the turn of events and the conclusion, somehow just like Lovecraft does, because in Lovecraft, as you said, the stories are more about ambience, about the atmosphere, rather than the unfolding of the events themselves. Okay, there are events, but it's more, I think, at least about the atmosphere. And in Junji Ito, we do see that a lot. Actually, in Japan, he's known because of that, because his stories are not the typical story in which the events unfold. As a matter of fact, he said one I don't remember exactly when, but he affirmed that he isn't even concerned about the end of the story. He's just concerned about the character and the motif of horror, the horror mechanism, and the event, the horrific event, let's say, and not even concerned about how that ends and how that finally concludes. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I have may I have a question for Alvaro now that if I have the chance. Alvaro, I was wondering, since what date is Lovecraft widely known? Do you know that an approximate date? Is he widely known in the Japanese, pop culture or academic culture?
Yes, I actually mentioned that he was introduced in Japan in 1950, in 1948 specifically. It was Edogawa Rampo, the Japanese writer, who introduced the Lovecraft's works in Japan. Something curious, perhaps, and that happens the other way around, vice versa, and that many people actually, I think, don't know, is that Lovecraft was somehow influenced by the Japanese context itself, because Lafcadio Hearn, the well-known British horror stories writer, was read by Lovecraft. I mean, Lovecraft read Lafcadio Hearn's stories, and he was somehow imbued already with the Japanese stuff. And I think it's something that in the long run afterwards has had an incidence in the sense that Lovecraft has been so widely read in Japan. Some people, I think, that asked in the chat why do I think that Lovecraft has been read in Japan, and I think that's one of the reasons, that he was previously acquainted with the Japanese folklore to a certain extent, at least. He was not an expert whatsoever, but he was already acquainted with that up to a certain extent, at least. So yeah, he was introduced in 1948 specifically.
Well, yeah, but my question, and sorry to be insistent on this, but yeah, he was introduced on that date, 48, but was he immediately being popularized or widely known? I know you may not know that because you were not there, but because it's a different point in time when you are introduced and when you become famous. And I ask you this because, as I mentioned later, we have some American literary critics up to 1977, including one that was editor of the New Yorker and the Boston Review, and Paul Theroux, another literary critic that is still alive, that did not publicly admit have never heard, not even read, but have never heard about Lovecraft. So I was amazed to hear that because there was people making movies. So in Japan, probably it was the other way around, that Lovecraft was already famous before being famous in the US.
No, I'd say it's been gradual. It's been gradual. The very first reference I have of Lovecraft's influence in Japan concerns manga, actually, and it's 1962, Shigeru Mizuki's manga. That's the very first reference I have. And I think, yes, you are right in that it's been more gradual. Actually, there have been many more influences later, but again, it's not actually it's been a whole decade because since he was introduced and the first work influenced by him was published. So it's been definitely gradual, yeah, and it's still going on. In 2002, this anthology of Japanese authors influenced by Lovecraft was published, Layers of the Hidden Gods, and it's still going on. That anthology has actually been recently translated into English in last year, I think, that was translated. So yeah, it's been gradual and still going on. Thanks.
Okay, so if anybody doesn't have now the questions to someone else, I would just raise the questions from the chat from our listeners. Okay, we have a question for Josefa. How would you tell what is actually Lovecraftian and what just borrows the name?
Well, this is an interesting question, but I believe there are 2 points of view on this. The first is whether the author of such work claims his affiliation to Lovecraft or Lovecraftian or not. So whether it is intendedly Lovecraftian or it is denoted as such by readers or the recipients of this work. And then the second point of view is whether it fulfills maybe some expectations or some standards of what we can call a Lovecraftian or based on Lovecraft's ideas. And in these terms, I would say that Lovecraftian is that which is compliant to Lovecraft's philosophy of cosmicism. So the emphasis on insignificance of humankind, on the vastness of space, maybe some aspects of madness and of all the alien that is incomprehensible by humans. These are, in my opinion, the typical characteristics of the Lovecraftian. And in these terms, maybe we can talk about, in terms of literature, for example, about the anthologies of the Dark Wings of Cthulhu, for example, or about the works of Laird Barron. Some of his short stories are Lovecraftian indeed, or maybe the female writer Caitlin Kiernan, for example. That's something that is intended, that is meant to be Lovecraftian. And when we talk about the unintentional, which is denoted as such later by the recipients. Maybe we can talk about manga, as Alvaro mentioned, the Junji Ito's manga, which carries these themes and topics and these aspects, for example. So that's probably the main difference.
Right. Thank you for the answer. Well, next one is okay. I will just skip because we had something on the chat on YouTube. Okay. So I guess this is the question for Alvaro. What was the first Lovecraft-influenced Japanese work, like in general, not only manga, I guess?
I don't know actually, but the very first, as I answered to Andres before, the very first one that I know concerns manga and is Shigeru Mitsuki's manga in 1962. I don't know if in literature there are some previous work to that one. I think not. So it's most likely that one, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question is okay. No, so I would have a question because we also read some of those before because some of us also written questions on the chat. But I have a question myself to Andre, because you've mentioned that Lovecraft has been influenced by Edgar Allan Poe. So actually, Edgar Allan Poe is somehow considered as a dark romantic because he acknowledges what is like in people's minds, and for him that is mostly the scary part of the story. The scary part of the story is not a ghost, is not a monster that is somewhere from the other world, but our mainly our minds are what is scary, and people are the real monsters in his stories. So, how do you think it works in the in Lovecraft works, in Lovecraft literature?
Wow. Well, the influence of Edgar Allan Poe, I think, in Lovecraft, I'm sure can be viewed from different points of view. But specifically, if we speak about the monster, I guess that the most relevant is the short tale, The Outsider, where the monster is not only the narrator of the tale, and he realizes that till the end. So it matches Edgar Allan Poe's idea that I am the monster, and at the same time has a physical monster in the outside, no? And the other one is the how would I say, invisible monster, the possibly from the color out of space, the color that fall from the, I can recall the specific name in English, no, which the monster is again a color, something intangible, something unfeasible, no? So one of the influence may be that, but also the psychology of the characters. You can see it at several points in the in Lovecraft's tales. I can tell you one exactly right now, but there's also this tale where he what's the name? Maybe somebody can help me. The tale where this alien is occupying the mind of an American academic, no? And again, The Shadow Out of Time. Yeah, of course, that's it. Thank you very much. So again, it is an alien consciousness from outer worlds occupying the mind of a human. No? So, but I think that's just one vein of comparison between Poe's influence on Lovecraft and possibly hundreds, if not more, because Edgar Allan Poe also has an apocalyptic tale about a meteor. Edgar Allan Poe invented the idea that a meteor will crash the Earth and destroy all life on it. And well, Lovecraft has tons of stories about meteors falling, and well, you can find possibly 100 comparisons between them. But specifically speaking about the character, I think those three examples are good.
All right, thank you. So you would see the influence just not mainly focusing on the mental aspect, but more of a general view of the author, right?
Yes, I would say psychological aspects, because we have lots of monologues. I think others here, Joseph and Shan, will know more than me. But yeah, the monologue is very characteristic. I think Lovecraft is trying to do something similar to Poe's, and also the themes. But the themes may not be easy to be seen. And Lovecraft also wrote always, I believe, two stories. One, a story with a plot, and then an underlying story with another objective, just to end rapidly.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, now I understand. Thank you for that. All right. So I would look at the chat if we have anything more. No, I don't think there is anything. Yeah, because I also had a question for Alvaro, but you already answered that, as you probably seen it on the chat. So yeah, so I guess we are going to end. I would like to thank you all for this fantastic panel. I really, really loved that. It was long. It was actually it was actually long for us, and well, it's an evening in Poland. I don't know about you, but I think we will have to end. But really, thank you for participating in this event. Thank you for fantastic presentations and for the talk. It was a pleasure talking to you in general. Yeah, I had a I would put your emails on the chat, but maybe we will do it like off the stream, because it will take me some time. So maybe we can stay together in here, and I will just put the emails on the chat, because if it's okay for you, is it? Okay, so thank you all officially, and Mateusz, we should probably end the stream. Thank you for the second day of PhilosophyCon, and we hope to see you all tomorrow on Sunday streams. Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations for this good idea. Great job to you and Mateusz.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I am now looking for the emails. Okay. I have the email of Andre.
Just put my own. I would actually prefer my Gmail